Picture the scene. It is a night devoid of the moon, where the water is not merely dark, but an abyssal mirror reflecting a sky indifferent to human ambition. April 14th, 1912. The world is asleep, or perhaps just holding its breath, as the largest moving object ever built slices through the freezing silence of the North Atlantic. To the casual observer, RMS Titanic is a triumph of engineering, a floating city of electric lights, mahogany and Edwardian arrogance. The passengers in their silk sheets believe they are safe in a palace that defies nature. But if you look past the chandeliers and the champagne, past the laughter fading in the smoking rooms, and descend into the steel belly of the beast, there is a pulse of something else, something clandestine. We have been told a story of hubris, of ice, and of tragedy. But there is another story whispered in the margins of history, hidden behind redacted manifests and sealed banking records. It is a story not of accidental death, but of calculated theft. Deep within the ship, in the high-security Royal Mail sorting room on the orlop deck, a cargo was rumored to be loaded, one that was never meant to reach New York and perhaps never meant to sink. What if the most famous maritime disaster in history was, in fact, the ultimate smokescreen for the perfect crime? Tonight, we unlock the heavy steel doors and step inside the vault. If you'd like to follow more investigations like this, consider subscribing for future episodes. To understand the magnitude of the crime, one must first descend far below the polished mahogany of the A-deck promenade, past the bustling kitchens where French chefs prepared consommé for aristocrats, and down into the ship's industrial bowel. Here, on the orlop deck, the air did not smell of lavender and expensive cigars. It smelled of ozone, damp steel, and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the reciprocating engines. This was the domain of the Royal Mail sorting room, a highly secure facility that gave the ship its RMS designation. It was a fortress within a fortress, designed to be impenetrable. To access it required authorization, specific keys, and a reason. And on this particular voyage, the reason was worth more than the ship itself. The crime we are investigating is not merely the negligence that led to the collision, although that plays its part. The central mystery revolves around a shipment that officially did not exist. According to the manifest, the Titanic carried mundane items, feathers, linen, machinery, and thousands of mailbags. But persistent reports, suppressed witness testimonies, and banking anomalies from 1912 suggest that a shadow cargo was loaded under the cover of darkness in Southampton. This cargo allegedly consisted of crates of gold bullion and bearer bonds, a massive, clandestine transfer of wealth between the Bank of England and financial interests in New York. The value of this shipment, adjusted for modern inflation, would be staggering, enough to destabilize economies or, conversely, to rescue a banking system on the brink of collapse. Why is this considered a crime and not just a tragic loss of assets? Because there is compelling evidence to suggest that this gold did not sink with the ship. The theory, dark and compelling, posits that the Titanic was not just a victim of an iceberg, but the stage for the most audacious heist of the 20th century. The premise is terrifyingly simple. The collision provided the ultimate distraction. While the world watched the drama of the lifeboats and the band playing on the boat deck, a different kind of operation was unfolding in the chaos below. The allegation is that a select group of men, possibly posing as crew or postal clerks, accessed the specie room, the ship's high-security vault, and moved the bullion. But to where? You cannot simply walk off a sinking ship with tons of gold. This is where the mystery deepens and connects to a phantom vessel seen by multiple witnesses. We have all heard of the Californian, the ship that sat idle and watched the Titanic die. But there was another ship, a ghost in the fog, known as the Samson. A Norwegian sealer, the Samson was operating illegally in waters it should not have been in. Its captain, Hendrik Naes, would later confess on his deathbed that he was indeed close enough to see the Titanic's lights. The official story is that they fled to avoid prosecution for illegal sealing, but the criminal theory suggests the Samson was the getaway driver, waiting at a prearranged coordinate to receive the offloaded cargo before the Titanic slipped beneath the surface. This transforms the narrative entirely. If true, It implies that the Titanic was steered into danger not by accident, but by design, or at the very least, that her distress was exploited with cold-blooded precision. It suggests that while 1,500 souls were freezing to death in the black water, a transfer of wealth was taking place mere miles away, shielded by the very darkness that doomed the passengers. The implications are monstrous. It would mean that specific officers or crew members were complicit, that the lack of binoculars was sabotage rather than oversight, and that the silence of the wireless operators at critical moments was purchased. The victims of this crime were not just the banks that lost their gold, if indeed they lost it, but the passengers who became collateral damage in a high-stakes financial game. The investigative thread we are pulling on suggests that the chaotic evacuation of the mailroom was not an attempt to save letters, as history records, but a frantic effort to move the crates before the water rose too high. Survivors reported seeing postal clerks forming a human chain, moving wet sacks up the gangways. We have always assumed these sacks contained letters, but wet paper is heavy and gold is heavier still. Why would 5 postal clerks, men of ordinary standing, sacrifice their chances of survival to save paper correspondence in the face of certain death? Unless, of course, they were under orders or under the gun to save something far more valuable. This mystery matters because it reframes the Titanic from a symbol of natural disaster to a crime scene. It introduces a human villain into a story usually dominated by ice and iron. We are looking at a conspiracy that required planning on both sides of the Atlantic. The suspects are not the stokers shoveling coal, but the men in the boardrooms of London and New York. Men like J. Pierpont Morgan, who owned the White Star Line but cancelled his passage at the last minute, claiming illness, only to be seen perfectly healthy in France days later. Was his cancellation a stroke of luck, or did he know that the ship was marked? The connection to the Titanic is visceral. The ship's design, with its watertight bulkheads and segregated decks, inadvertently created the perfect environment for a heist. The confusion of the sinking, the sheer size of the vessel, and the rigid class separation meant that what happened on the orlop deck stayed on the orlop deck. First-class passengers sipping brandy in the smoking room would have no idea that beneath their feet, a fortune was being spirited away. The crime relies on the scale of the tragedy to hide itself. Who looks for missing crates when they are looking for missing bodies? As we delve deeper into this investigation, we will uncover inconsistencies that have been glossed over for a century. We will look at the strange maneuvers of the mystery ship on the horizon, the inexplicable delay in distress signals, and the sealed testimony of crew members who saw things they were told to forget. We are not just retelling the sinking. We are reopening a cold case file that has been sitting at the bottom of the North Atlantic for over 100 years. The water is deep, the pressure is immense, and the truth has been buried under layers of sediment and sentiment. But the cracks in the official story are there if you know where to look. And as the lights flicker and the ship begins its slow, agonizing death in our narrative, we must ask, was the iceberg the only predator in the water that night? Or was there something else, something human and hungry, waiting in the dark? The ice may have sunk the ship, but greed may have sealed its fate. The vault is open. The investigation begins. To comprehend how a leviathan like the Titanic could become the scene of a covert operation, we must first step back from the dock and immerse ourselves in the suffocating opulence of the Edwardian era. It was 1912, a year that balanced precariously on the edge of the modern world, yet remained tethered to the rigid hierarchies of the past. This was the twilight of the Gilded Age, a period defined by a desperate need for spectacle. Society was a theatre where the sets were built of marble and gold leaf, but the foundations were rotting. In the smoke-filled gentlemen's clubs of London and New York, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and British confidence, men believed they had finally conquered nature. They believed that steel and steam had rendered the chaotic forces of the ocean obsolete. This arrogance was not merely a personality trait, it was a systemic blindness, a collective delusion that created the perfect blind spot for a criminal mind to exploit. The maritime world was locked in a ferocious commercial war. The Atlantic Ocean was not just a body of water, it was the most lucrative trade route on the planet, a battleground for national pride and corporate dominance. On one side stood the Cunard Line, subsidized by the British government, boasting the Mauretania and Lusitania, ships that were essentially greyhounds of the sea, built for blistering speed. Sight start. On the other side were the German lines, the Hamburg America and North German Lloyd, whose efficiency and rising luxury were making the British establishment nervous. Sight 10. Sight start. Caught in the middle was the White Star Line, led by J. Bruce Ismay, a man who detested being second best. Sight 11. Ismay knew he could not win the race for speed, so he chose to change the rules of the game. He would build floating palaces. Sight astart. He would crush his rivals with sheer scale and suffocating luxury. Sight 16. But luxury is expensive, and margins in the shipping industry were razor thin. The Olympic-class sisters, Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, were a staggering financial gamble. They had to succeed. This immense pressure created a corporate culture where the appearance of perfection was more important than the reality of safety. It was an environment where executives prioritized the seamless experience of the first-class passenger over the gritty details of operational security. In such a high-stakes corporate ecosystem, moral compromises become easier to justify. If a powerful banking syndicate approached the White Star Line with a request to transport an off-the-book shipment of bullion to shore up American accounts, would they say no? Or would they see it as a necessary favor to the men who controlled the flow of capital? Economically, the world was still trembling from the aftershocks of the Panic of 1907, a financial crisis that had nearly decimated the American banking system. Trust in paper currency was low, gold was the only anchor. In 1912, the movement of physical wealth between Europe and America was constant, frantic, and dangerous. The establishment of the Federal Reserve was still a year away. The financial architecture was fragile. This instability meant that massive sums of money were often moved in secret to avoid triggering public panic. The Titanic, with her reputation as a fortress, was the ideal courier. She was too big to fail, too safe to sink. Who would dare rob a ship that carried the cream of society? The very idea seemed preposterous, which is exactly why it was the perfect cover. This atmosphere of invincibility bled into the regulations, or lack thereof, that governed the seas. The British Board of Trade, the entity responsible for maritime safety, was operating with rules written for a bygone era. Sight start. Their regulations for lifeboat capacity were based on a ship's tonnage, not its passenger count. Sight 619. They assumed that a ship like Titanic was its own lifeboat, designed to float even if breached. Sight start. The lifeboats were viewed merely as ferries to transfer passengers to a rescue ship, not as life-saving vessels for a total sinking. Sight 620. This regulatory gap was not a secret. It was a known statistic, accepted by the engineers and the owners. To a criminal planner, this was not a safety flaw, it was a tactical advantage. It meant that in the event of a staged emergency or a distraction, chaos was guaranteed. There would be no orderly evacuation, no surplus of eyes watching the cargo holds. There would only be panic, and panic is the thief's greatest ally. Furthermore, the technology that was supposed to save them, wireless telegraphy, was still in its infancy, treated more as a luxury concierge service for wealthy passengers than a critical safety system. Sight start. The wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were employees of the Marconi Company, not the White Star Line. Sight 60. Their priority was sending stock tips and social greetings for millionaires, not bridging the gap between life and death. This commercialization of communication meant that the airwaves were clogged with trivialities while ice warnings struggled to break through. It created a noisy, chaotic electromagnetic environment where a distress signal could be missed, or perhaps where a specific frequency could be jammed or ignored by a Confederate ship nearby. Sight start. The lack of 24-hour radio watch on other vessels, like the Californian Sight 678, was another loophole in the net, a gap through which a ghost ship like the Samson could slip unnoticed. The corporate mentality of 1912 was defined by a dangerous mixture of complacency and greed. Sight start. Captain Edward Smith, a man of immense experience and dignity. Sight 80, famously declared years earlier that he could not imagine any condition that would cause a ship to founder. Cite start. Modern shipbuilding has gone beyond that, he said, cite 83. This was the dogma of the age. It was a belief system that viewed nature as a conquered subject. But this hubris acted as a blinder. When you believe a system is perfect, you stop looking for cracks, you stop checking the shadows. You assume the mailroom is secure because the ship is unsinkable. You assume the manifest is accurate because the company is reputable. In this context, the Titanic was not just a ship. She was a symbol of an empire that believed it was untouchable. But beneath the velvet and the rivets, the structural integrity of this society was as brittle as the iron of the hull would prove to be in freezing water. The pressures to maintain profit, the desperate need to move capital, the antiquated laws and the supreme arrogance of the ruling class created a perfect storm. It was an environment where a conspiracy could take root and flourish, protected by the assumption that such things simply didn't happen to people of our class. The stage was set not just for a tragedy, but for a crime that relied on the world's blind faith in its own technological godhood. The ship was ready to sail and the trap was ready to spring. To identify the players in this maritime shadow play, we must look beyond the familiar faces of the heroes and villains established by popular culture. We know the story of the unsinkable Molly Brown and the stoic Captain Smith. But in a crime of this magnitude, the true architects often stand just outside the frame in the blurred edges of the photograph. The cast of this investigation is a mix of historical figures whose actions take on a sinister hue when viewed through the lens of a heist, and the invisible men whose presence on the ship was never officially recorded. At the apex of the visible hierarchy stands J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line. History remembers him as the coward who snuck into a lifeboat, but in our investigation, he is the mark. Cite start. Ismay was a man consumed by the terror of mediocrity. Cite 9, 10, 11. Cite start. He was tall, with a heavy mustache, and the bearing of a man who would challenge his own shadow to a duel if it dared to be longer than him. Cite 12. His motivation was not money in the simple sense, but legacy. Cite start. He needed Titanic to be a triumph to crush his German rivals. Cite 10. This desperation made him vulnerable. A desperate man is easily manipulated by powerful financial interests who might say, "We need a secure transport for a special shipment, and your ship is the only one we trust." Ismay, blinded by the flattery and the need for solvency, becomes the perfect unwitting accomplice. Or perhaps a man who asked too few questions because the answers would have been too profitable. If Ismay is the face, then the hands of the operation must be someone with operational control. Enter Chief Officer Henry Wilde. His presence on the Titanic is a significant anomaly in the timeline. Wilde was not supposed to be there. Cite start. He was transferred from the Olympic at the very last minute, a sudden administrative shift that bumped the experienced William Murdoch and Charles Lightoller down a rank, causing friction and confusion among the senior crew. Cite 85. Why disrupt the chain of command days before a maiden voyage? The official reason was his experience with the Olympic-class ships. But through the lens of a heist, Wilde becomes the cleaner, the man inserted by the company or the syndicate to oversee the special cargo. He was a man of few words, a professional, but his letters written from the ship express a strange, lingering dread. "I still don't like this ship," he wrote to his sister. "I have a queer feeling about it." Was this a premonition of disaster, or the anxiety of a man who knew he was sitting on a powder keg of illicit bullion? Opposing these forces are the guardians of the vault, the 5 seapost clerks. These men, Oscar Scott Woody, John Richard Jago Smith, and their colleagues, are the tragic heroes of our crime story. They were not sailors, they were civil servants, fiercely proud and meticulously bureaucratic. Woody was an American, a man who took the sanctity of the mail as a sacred oath. These men held the keys. They were the only ones authorized to open the specie room. For a heist to work, these men had to be neutralized, bribed, or tricked. Cite A start. History tells us they died trying to save the mailbags, dragging them up from the flooding orlop deck. Cite 365. But why? Why die for letters? Unless they weren't just saving mail. unless they had discovered the theft in progress during the flooding and were trying to save the evidence, or perhaps they were being forced at gunpoint to move the crates under the guise of saving the mail by the very men robbing the ship. Their devotion is the variable the thieves didn't account for. Then there is the figure of Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, sight start a perfectionist who would redesign a doorknob 17 times to improve efficiency. 22. Sight start, Andrews knew every rivet, every bulkhead, every cubic inch of space sight. 25. He is the detective who arrives too late. Sight start. He spent the voyage roaming the ship with his notebook, checking for rattling pipes and drafty windows. Sight 149. If anyone could spot an unauthorized modification to the mailroom, or a partition wall that was slightly closer than it should be to hide a hollow space, it was Andrews. His notebook, lost with him, might have contained the first clues of the crime, observations of weight distribution anomalies or unauthorized personnel on G-deck. His tragic fate was not just drowning. It was the silencing of the one man who could have mathematically proven the cargo was not what the manifest claimed. Hovering in the background is the enigmatic Captain Edward Smith. Sight start, the millionaire's captain, beloved by the rich for his charm and safety record. Sight 7880. Sight start, he was 62 preparing for retirement. Sight 79. Sight start, he was the father figure. The maritime Santa Claus. Sight 80. But was he compromised? A man at the end of his career is sometimes looking for a golden parachute. Or perhaps he was simply too trusting, a man of the old world who could not conceive of a crime so modern and so ruthless. His role in the conspiracy is likely passive, the distracted figurehead whose confidence was used against him. He was looking at the stars, while the wolves were in the hold. Finally, we must consider the passengers who did not fit. Witness reports from the inquests mention groups of men in third class who were disciplined, kept to themselves, and seemed to have a military bearing. Sight start. They were not the typical immigrants like the Sage family with their 9 children. Sight 99. Sight start. Nor were they musicians like Eugene Daly with his bagpipes. Sight 112. These were the muscle, the operatives planted to move the heavy crates when the time came. They are the ghosts of the manifest, men who boarded under false names and whose bodies, if recovered, were never identified. And watching them all across the bridge of time are the modern experts, the forensic accountants analyzing the 1912 gold standard, the naval architects running computer simulations of the flooding to see if the mailroom doors were opened intentionally, and the historians piecing together the fragmented timelines. They are the new protagonists, sifting through the silt of a century to find the fingerprint of a crime. These are our players, a desperate executive, a suspicious officer, a team of doomed clerks, an innocent architect, and a shadow crew of thieves. They are all trapped together in a steel box, moving at 22 knots toward an immutable destiny. The tension between them is not just social, it is criminal. As the ship steams westward, the friction between their competing agendas, profit, duty, survival, and theft, begins to generate sparks. And on a ship filled with coal dust, a single spark is all it takes to cause an explosion. The stage is fully set, the actors are in place, and the ice is waiting. To understand the sheer audacity of the crime, one must first inhabit the mesmerizing, dangerous tranquility that settled over the ship in the hours before the end. The evening of April 14th did not look like a disaster waiting to happen. It looked like a masterpiece of atmospheric perfection. The sun had set in a blaze of violent orange and bruised purple, painting the sky in colors so brilliant that passengers gathered on the boat deck to watch the spectacle, remarking that they had never seen the Atlantic so peaceful. The ocean was a sheet of black glass, unmarred by waves, reflecting the stars with such clarity that the horizon line seemed to dissolve, merging the sea and the sky into one infinite void. It was a silence so profound that it felt curated, a stage set designed to lull the audience into a state of absolute fatal complacency. This unnatural calm was the accomplice the thieves had been praying for. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was electric with the hum of civilized pleasure. The Titanic was not merely a vessel, She was a sensory containment field designed to make you forget you were floating on 4 miles of freezing water. In the first-class dining saloon, the air was warm and scented with roasting duckling, expensive tobacco, and the faint, powdery perfume of high society. The room was a vast expanse of white Jacobean paneling and leaded glass, glowing under the light of hundreds of crystal bulbs. Here, the who's who of the Edwardian world dined on an 11-course meal that was a logistical miracle. Oysters, consommé Olga, poached salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon lily, and punch romaine to cleanse the palates that were busy discussing the coal strike, the stock market, and the delightful novelty of the ship's vibration. The dinner was not just a meal, it was a ritual of stability. John Jacob Astor IV sat at the captain's table, arguably the richest man on the planet, his very presence a testament to the ship's invulnerability. Beside him, the Strausses, the Wideners, and the Thayers ate with the relaxed confidence of people who owned the world. The orchestra played Puccini and Lehar, the music drifting through the palm courts like a narcotic mist. It was a scene of such overpowering normalcy that the very idea of danger seemed like a breach of etiquette. But while the stewards poured vintage champagne and the violins wept their sweet melodies, a very different kind of activity was allegedly taking place 20 feet beneath their patent leather shoes. The brilliance of the heist lay in its synchronization with the ship's routine. While the passengers were distracted by the theater of dinner, the ship's shadow rhythm took over. In the lower decks, the noise of the dining saloon was replaced by the rhythmic, deafening pound of the reciprocating engines, a mechanical heartbeat that vibrated through the steel floors. This sound was crucial. It was the acoustic camouflage for the crime. Any metallic clank, any grinding of a heavy crate being dragged across a steel deck, any thud of a vault door being manipulated, would be swallowed whole by the 30,000 horsepower roar of the engine room. The thieves did not need silence. They needed the specific industrial cacophony of a ship steaming at 22 knots. Down on F deck and G deck, far from the orchestral grandeur, the environment was utilitarian, stark, and confusingly labyrinthine. The corridors here were narrow, lined with steam pipes and painted in white enamel that gleamed under harsh electric bulbs. This was the territory of the squash court, the swimming pool, and the entrance to the mailroom. At this hour, the area was relatively quiet. The postal clerks should have been celebrating the birthday of Oscar Scott Woody, the clerk whose 44th birthday fell on this very day. Perhaps they were toasting with a smuggled bottle of wine, their guard down for just a moment. Or perhaps the celebration was the opening the thieves used, a moment of distraction created to facilitate the first phase of the extraction. We must picture the scene in the Turkish baths, located on F deck. It was a surreal sanctuary of Moorish tiles and heated air, a place of exotic luxury buried deep in the ship. At night it was officially closed, a silent temple of blue and green tiles. But its proximity to the lower cargo access points makes it a person of interest in the architectural geography of the crime. Was this the staging ground? A place where conspirators could meet away from the prying eyes of the bridge officers? The silence of the cooling room, with its comfortable teak lounges, offered a perfect, private boardroom for men finalizing the logistics of a bullion transfer, all while the unsuspecting victims slept or partied just a few decks above. The contrast between the upper and lower worlds was the essential friction of the night. Up on A deck, men in tuxedos smoked cigars and debated the speed of the crossing, joking that they might arrive in New York a day early. They were living in a linear timeline of progress. Down in the hold, the timeline was counting down to an intercept. The passengers involved in the plot, the men we suspect were operatives, would have been moving with purpose, blending into the background of the ship's operations. A steward carrying a stack of towels is invisible. A crewman checking a bulkhead is invisible. In a city of 3,000 strangers, anonymity is the easiest disguise to wear. The brilliance of the timing cannot be overstated. Sunday night on a ship is a time of winding down. The religious services earlier in the day, led by Captain Smith and Father Biles, had cast a sheen of piety and peace over the vessel. The hymn Eternal Father, Strong to Save had been sung, a plea for protection from the perils of the sea. It is a grim irony that while the passengers prayed for safety, The men plotting the theft were counting on the sea's peril to cover their tracks. They relied on the peril being a manageable distraction, a fire in a bunker, a minor mechanical failure, or perhaps a rendezvous with a vessel like the Samson. They never anticipated that the peril would be an ice field so vast it would swallow the entire stage. As 11:00 p.m. approached, the ship settled into a quiet hum. The libraries emptied. The stewards began dimming the lights in the corridors. The temperature outside plummeted, a physical warning that the environment was changing, but inside the heating systems compensated, maintaining the illusion of a warm, safe cocoon. In the specie room, the steel remained cold. The mailbags sat in their racks, silent witnesses to the intrusion that was about to occur, or was already occurring. The heavy doors, the tumblers of the locks, the sheer weight of the gold, all of it sat in the dark, waiting. The scene was set. The victims were sedated by luxury. The witnesses were distracted by the beauty of the starry night. The machinery of the ship provided the noise. The vastness of the ocean provided the privacy. It was, in every measurable way, the perfect night for a crime. The Titanic was not just steaming toward an iceberg. She was steaming toward a collision between the illusion of Edwardian order and the chaotic reality of human greed. The peace was a lie. The safety was a hologram. And the silence was about to be broken by a sound that would echo for eternity, not the sound of an impact, but the sound of a plan spiraling catastrophically out of control. To detect a crime in progress, one must often look not at the weapon, but at the silence that precedes the shot. As Sunday, April 14th progressed, the North Atlantic began to whisper warnings that were systematically, almost methodically silenced. These were not the overt screams of a disaster, but the subtle accumulation of errors that, when viewed through the lens of a conspiracy, looked less like bad luck and more like a checklist of sabotage. The ocean was trying to save the Titanic, sending message after message about the ice field ahead. But inside the ship, the lines of communication were being severed one by one, creating a cone of silence around the vessel that would ensure her isolation when the moment of the rendezvous arrived. The first sign of danger was not a sound, but a suppression of information. Throughout the day, the wireless room, the nerve center of the ship, received multiple warnings. Site SAG start, the Coronia reported ice site 232. Site SAG start, the Baltic reported large icebergs, site 233. Site SAG start, the America and the Athenia chimed in with their own ominous sightings, site 195-196. In a normal operational environment, these messages would have been treated as high-priority navigational data, walked directly to the bridge and plotted on the chart by the captain or the officer of the watch. Yet, many of these warnings were treated with a casual disregard that borders on the inexplicable. They were noted, pocketed, or delayed. Captain Smith received the Baltic's warning, but instead of posting it immediately on the bridge, he reportedly handed it to J. Bruce Ismay, who tucked it into his pocket like a souvenir, showing it off to passengers later in the day. Why would the managing director of the line possess a critical navigation warning? In the context of a heist, this is a power move. It is the action of a man who needs to control the narrative of the voyage, who needs to ensure that the ship maintains her course and speed despite the dangers. If the ship slows down or diverts south, the rendezvous with the extraction vessel, the Samson or another Confederate ship, would be missed. The schedule of a crime is rigid. It cannot accommodate the caution of a prudent sailor. Therefore, the warnings had to be minimized. The ship had to keep moving toward the ambush point, blindly and swiftly. The situation in the Marconi room offers the most damning evidence of this manufactured blindness. Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were overwhelmed, not just by the job, but by a backlog of passenger telegrams that had accumulated after the wireless equipment had temporarily failed the day before. They were exhausted, but the pivotal moment occurred at 9:40 p.m., when the Misaba sent a message that was not just a warning, but a precise map of destruction. Site start, it reported heavy pack ice and large icebergs directly in Titanic's path, site 285. This message was the smoking gun of navigation. If delivered to the bridge, it would have forced the officers to stop the ship or drastically alter course. But it never left the wireless room. Sight Start Phillips, frantically tapping out messages for wealthy passengers, set it aside, Site 286. Was this merely fatigue, or was the wireless room compromised? In a heist scenario, controlling the flow of information is paramount. If you want to stage a collision, or a stop in the middle of the ocean to offload gold, you cannot have the bridge officers turning the ship around because of a telegram. You need the ship to enter the danger zone. The suppression of the Mesaba message ensured that the Titanic would sail straight into the trap. The official narrative calls it a tragedy of overwork. The criminal narrative calls it the removal of the last safety net. Then came the incident with the Californian. Sight Start. At 10:30 p.m., the nearby ship, commanded by Captain Stanley Lord, sent a message stating they were stopped and surrounded by ice Site 288. This was the loudest warning yet. They were literally shouting, "Do not come here." Sight Start Phillips' response was immediate and violent. Shut up, I'm busy." Site 289. He cut off the warning to continue communicating with the relay station at Cape Race. Sight Start. The operator on the Californian, offended and tired, turned off his wireless set and went to bed, Site 290. This act of digital silence was the final lock clicking into place. The Californian went deaf. The Titanic was now alone. But was the Californian merely a bystander? Conspiracy theorists have long argued that Captain Lord's ship was stopped not just because of ice, but because it was waiting for a signal, waiting for a cargo transfer. The fact that they turned off their radio meant they could not be hailed by other ships, ensuring that any communication between the Titanic and the Californian, or the Samson, would have to be visual, rockets, Morse lamps or flares. It created a private channel of communication in the middle of the public ocean. By silencing the wireless, they ensured that no one else would overhear the logistics of the crime. Simultaneously, a more tactile omen was manifesting on the decks. The temperature began to drop with a violence that shocked even the experienced crew. Sight Start. In a matter of hours, the air went from a brisk evening to a freezing 31 degrees Site 272, 318. The lookouts in the Crow's Nest, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, were freezing. Sight Start. They stamped their feet and rubbed their hands, their breath clouding in the starlight, Site 320. But they were missing the one tool that could have leveled the playing field: binoculars. Sight Start. The keys to the binocular cabinet had been removed from the ship by Second Officer David Blair, who was transferred off in Southampton Site 205. For 100 years, this has been cited as a simple, unfortunate oversight. But in the grammar of sabotage, removing the binoculars is a masterstroke. It leaves the ship dependent on the naked eye, reducing the warning time from minutes to seconds. It ensures that any obstacle, be it an iceberg or a waiting ship, is seen only when it is too late to avoid, or perhaps just in time to execute a hard starboard turn that scrubs speed and brings the vessel to a shuddering halt without causing total destruction. The lack of binoculars blinded the watchman, making the ship vulnerable to whatever was waiting in the dark. And so the stage was meticulously prepared. The radio was clogged with trivia, suppressing the warnings. The nearby ship was deaf and silent. The lookouts were blind. The captain was distracted by social obligations. The temperature had dropped, signaling the presence of the ice that would serve as the weapon. Every safety system that should have protected the Titanic had been dismantled or disabled, not by force but by a series of coincidences so precise they defy statistical probability. As 11:30 p.m. approached, the Titanic was no longer a safe ship. She was a blindfolded runner sprinting toward a cliff edge. The silence on the ocean was not peace. It was the holding of breath before a murder. The passengers in their warm bunks felt only the gentle vibration of the engines, unaware that the men on the bridge were navigating through a minefield with a map they had been forbidden to see. The first signs of danger were there for anyone to see, but no one was looking. Or perhaps the people who were looking were the ones who had ensured the danger was unavoidable. The trap was set, the gold was waiting, and the ice was about to deliver the final crushing blow that would make the crime invisible. To reshape our understanding of the Titanic disaster, we must strip away the sentimental veneer of the unsinkable ship and examine the cold, hard mechanics of the event through the lens of forensic criminology. The central hypothesis of this investigation is not that the Titanic was sunk to claim insurance money, a popular but easily debunked theory given the ship was underinsured, but that the maiden voyage was the Trojan horse for a massive illicit transfer of sovereign assets. We call this the Atlantic extraction theory. It posits that the collision with the iceberg was not the intended finale of the plot, but rather the catastrophic failure of a plan that relied on a manufactured emergency stop in the middle of the ocean. The theory argues that the conspiracy was designed to be bloodless. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The Titanic was scheduled to steam at full speed toward a known ice field. This is why the warnings were ignored, not out of negligence but out of necessity. To justify stopping a mail steamer in the middle of the Atlantic, a captain needs a tangible threat. You cannot simply cut the engines of the world's most famous ship without an explanation. But if the ship enters a heavy ice field, the captain has the perfect, unassailable excuse to order a precautionary halt. He stops the ship, ostensibly for safety, drifting in the calm, dark waters under the cover of a navigation hazard. Once the ship is stopped, the rendezvous begins. The Samson or another vessel, loitering in the prearranged coordinates, the mystery ship seen by lookouts, pulls alongside under the cloak of darkness. The cargo, crates of unregistered bullion or bearer bonds stored in the specie room, is offloaded through the lower shell doors on E deck or F deck, which were designed for loading coal and cargo in port. These doors were close to the waterline and away from the prying eyes of the passengers on the upper promenade. The transfer would take an hour, perhaps two. Once completed, the mystery ship vanishes into the night. The Titanic resumes her voyage the next morning, arriving in New York a hero for having navigated the dangerous ice field with such prudence. The gold is gone, the records are clean, and the perfect crime has been committed in the middle of the ocean where there are no police and no witnesses. This hypothesis explains the otherwise inexplicable behavior of Captain Smith and J. Bruce Ismay. It explains why they possessed ice warnings but did not slow down. They weren't ignoring the ice, they were hunting for it. They needed the ice field to be the stage for their halt. It explains the erratic wireless behavior, keeping the airwaves clear or silenced to prevent premature rescue or interference. It explains why the lookouts were denied binoculars. The conspirators needed the ship to be blind enough to justify the danger, but they gambled that the naked eye would be sufficient to spot the ice in time to stop safely before hitting it. They were threading a needle between a justifiable stop and a fatal collision. The motive for such a high-risk operation lies in the geopolitical and financial instability of 1912. The gold standard was the bedrock of the global economy, but the physical movement of gold was risky and slow. A secret transfer of this magnitude, speculated to be worth millions in 1912 currency, could have been used to settle covert debts between European monarchies and American industrial trusts, bypassing the scrutiny of parliaments and tax authorities. If the gold was legally lost at sea, it could be written off while the physical assets were quietly recirculated by the conspirators. It was a way to create money out of thin air, collect the insurance on the lost cargo if insured, or simply erase the existence of the assets while keeping the physical gold. Critics of this theory, primarily traditional maritime historians, argue that the logistics are too complex. They point to the difficulty of moving heavy crates in the open ocean and the sheer number of people who would need to be silent. They argue that Captain Smith was a man of honor who would never endanger his passengers. But proponents of the criminal theory counter that Smith may not have known the full extent of the danger. He might have been told it was a covert government transfer, essential for national security, appealing to his patriotism rather than his greed. He might have believed the stop would be perfectly safe, a simple pause in calm waters. He didn't sign up for a sinking, he signed up for a stop. The most compelling piece of the puzzle that supports this theory is the mystery ship itself. The Californian is the vessel usually blamed for not responding, but the Samson fits the profile of a smuggler far better. A Norwegian sealer would have the rough-and-ready crew, the deck space, and the lack of official oversight required for such a job. If the Samson was the extraction vessel, its presence near the Titanic was not a coincidence, it was an appointment. The fact that the Samson later claimed to be illegally sealing gives them a cover story for being there, but it also conveniently explains why they fled when the rockets started firing. In the criminal version of events, they didn't flee because they were sealing, they fled because the plan had gone wrong. The Titanic hadn't just stopped, she had struck the ice. She was sinking. The extraction was aborted, or perhaps partially completed before the chaos made it impossible to continue. This theory also casts a new light on the watertight bulkheads. If the conspirators intended to open lower shell doors or move cargo through secure areas, did they tamper with the locking mechanisms? Did they disable certain safety features to allow easier movement of the crates? When the collision occurred, these compromised defenses might have accelerated the sinking. The ship, rigged for a heist, was made vulnerable to a disaster. The very doors opened to offload the gold became the mouths that swallowed the ocean. As we look at the timeline of that night, we see the tragic intersection of a criminal timeline and a natural timeline. The conspirators were watching their watches, waiting for the rendezvous time. Nature was watching the temperature, freezing the water into a weapon. The collision at 11:40 p.m. was the moment these two timelines crashed into each other. The heist turned into a horror story. But in the immediate aftermath of the impact, while the passengers were still confused, the behavior of certain crew members suggests that the mission was still active. Was the gold abandoned? Or did the thieves try to salvage what they could even as the water rose around their waists? The Atlantic extraction theory changes the genre of the Titanic story. It is no longer a romance or a tragedy of hubris. It is a noir thriller. It suggests that the 1,500 people who died were not just victims of an iceberg, but collateral damage in a boardroom deal gone wrong. It asks us to believe that the silence of the ocean that night was filled with the invisible tension of men waiting for a signal that came in the form of a crunch of steel against ice rather than the flash of a signal lamp. The pieces are all there. The gold, the secrecy, the reckless speed, the missing binoculars, the mystery ship. All that is missing is the confession. And the only men who could give it are drifting in the dark, somewhere past the continental shelf. To reconstruct a crime that occurred more than a century ago, we must act as forensic archaeologists, brushing away the silt of legend to reveal the jagged edges of fact. The evidence for the Atlantic extraction theory does not lie in a single smoking gun, but in a constellation of anomalies, small, jagged pieces of the puzzle that, when pressed together, form a picture of deliberate action rather than accidental chaos. These are the details that the official inquiries in 1912 brushed aside as confusion of the moment, but which, to a modern investigator, scream of procedural irregularity. We begin our examination of the preliminary evidence not on the bridge, but deep in the flooding bowels of the ship, where the behavior of the victims tells a story that contradicts the official narrative of heroism. The first and most disturbing piece of evidence centers on the 5 seapost clerks: Oscar Scott Woody, John Richard Jago Smith, James Bertram Williamson, John Edward Simpson, and William Logan Gwynn. The official story paints a tableau of tragic duty. These men, realizing the mailroom on the orlop deck was flooding, spent their final moments dragging heavy sacks of registered mail up the stairs to higher decks, ostensibly to save them from the water. This image was celebrated in the press, but forensic logic demands we ask a harder question. Why? The water in the mailroom was freezing, rising fast, and bringing with it the crushing weight of inevitable death. These were intelligent men. They knew that dragging wet, heavy canvas sacks up narrow steel staircases in a sinking ship was a futile gesture. A sack of mail does not float. It does not save a life. In a genuine emergency, the instinct is survival, not administration. However, if we view this through the lens of the heist theory, their actions take on a darker hue. Were they dragging mailbags, or were they moving the crates of bullion that had been disguised inside mailbags? If the extraction was interrupted by the collision, the priority would have shifted from offloading to hiding. Or perhaps they were not acting of their own free will. Testimony from a steward who survived suggests that the area around the mailroom was cordoned off by officers he didn't recognize. Were the clerks working under the barrel of a gun, forced to move the evidence to a higher deck where it could be accessed by the conspirators later, or perhaps loaded onto a lifeboat. Their bodies, specifically Woody's, were found floating in life jackets. This indicates they eventually made it to the surface, but too late. The time they spent moving the mail cost them their lives. The second, and perhaps most critical piece of physical evidence, is the mystery of the portside gangway door. During the sinking, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, a man of unimpeachable reputation, reported seeing one of the massive shell doors on D-deck open. This is a baffling detail. These doors were heavy, steel barriers designed to be sealed at sea. Opening them required effort, multiple men, and a specific reason. Lightoller assumed it was opened on the orders of an officer to facilitate loading lifeboats from a lower deck, a plan that was never executed. But maritime architects have since argued that opening a door so close to the waterline while the ship was down by the bow was suicidal. It allowed water to bypass the watertight bulkheads and pour directly into the upper sections of the ship, accelerating the sinking and causing the portside list. Why was that door open? In the context of the heist, the open gangway door is the entry wound of the crime. If the plan was to offload gold to the Samson, the transfer would likely have happened through a lower shell door on E-deck or the gangway door on D-deck. The door was opened not to save passengers, but to push crates out to a waiting tender. When the collision happened and the ship began to pitch forward, the door could not be closed against the angle and the rushing water. The conspirators, in their greed, had breached the ship's hull from the inside. They left the back door open, and the Atlantic walked right in. This open door transforms the sinking from a gradual decline into a rapid plunge. The crime literally sank the ship. We must also scrutinize the visual evidence of the mystery ship itself. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, scanning the horizon with his binoculars, which he had to borrow as his own were missing, swore he saw the masthead lights of a steamer about 5 or 6 miles away. He saw the green starboard light, meaning the ship was facing them. He fired distress rockets, white, starbursting signals that are universally recognized as a cry for help. Boxhall testified that the ship seemed to approach, then stopped, and then turned away, showing her red port light before disappearing into the mist. The official inquiry pinned this on the Californian, but the geometry doesn't fit. The Californian was stopped in ice, facing a different direction. The ship Boxhall saw was moving. It was reacting. This behavior, approach, hesitation, retreat, is the classic profile of a getaway driver who sees police lights and aborts the pickup. The Samson, or whatever vessel was the intended recipient of the gold, saw the rockets not as a signal to come closer, but as a signal that the quiet transfer had turned into a loud disaster. The rockets illuminated the crime scene. Fearing exposure, the extraction vessel fled, leaving the conspirators and the gold trapped on the dying ship. The mystery ship didn't ignore the Titanic. It abandoned her to cover its tracks. Then there is the matter of the purser's safe. Chief Purser Herbert McElroy was a man responsible for the valuables of the wealthiest people on Earth. First-class passengers deposited their jewelry and cash in his safe for the voyage. After the sinking, rumors swirled that the safe had been emptied before the ship went down. Not by the passengers reclaiming their diamonds in a panic, many survivors reported leaving everything behind, but by someone else. If the gold heist was the primary objective, the contents of the purser's safe would have been a tempting secondary target, or chump change for the operatives to grab on their way out. The fact that so few jewels were found on recovered bodies, despite the immense wealth on board, raises the question, were the pockets of the dead picked before they even entered the water? Or was the safe cleaned out by the same shadow crew moving the bullion? We also face the silence of the logs. The logbook of the Titanic went down with the ship, a convenient loss for anyone wishing to hide the navigational decisions of the final hours. But the logbook of the Samson also has a story to tell. Years later, research into the Norwegian sealer's movements revealed inconsistencies in its reported coordinates for April 14th. The logs appeared to have been revised, dates smudged, locations vague. Why would a seal hunter falsify his location unless he was hunting something far more valuable than pelts? And why did the crew of the Samson wait decades before whispering on their deathbeds about the big ship and the lights they left behind? Finally, we look at the cargo manifest itself. There are two versions, the one filed in Southampton and the one filed in New York. Discrepancies between load lists are common in shipping, but the omission of specific high-value declarations in the public records, contrasted with the high insurance premiums paid by unnamed banking consortiums in London just days before sailing, creates a paper trail of intent. The insurance was not for the ship, it was for the cargo. And usually when you insure something for a massive sum, you expect it to arrive, or you expect it to disappear. The evidence is fragmentary, yes, it is waterlogged and rusted. But when you place the open shell door next to the fleeing mystery ship and the dying postal clerks next to the silenced wireless warnings, a pattern emerges. It is the pattern of a timeline that was manipulated. The Titanic was not just a victim of bad luck, she was a victim of a script that went off the rails. The accident was the cover, but the evidence suggests the cover-up began the moment the first rocket was fired. The preliminary investigation is complete. Now we must reconstruct the night itself to see exactly how the plan fell apart. To reconstruct the night of April 14th is to walk through a crime scene where the evidence is moving at 22 knots toward a concrete wall. We must synchronize the watches of history with the stopwatch of the heist. The timeline we are about to trace does not follow the rhythm of a disaster, but the cadence of a covert operation that was dependent on split-second timing, silence, and the complicity of the night itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the Titanic ceased to be a floating hotel and became a pressurized chamber of secrets. At 7:00 p.m., the temperature began its precipitous drop, falling 10 degrees in 2 hours. To a sailor, this is not just weather, it is a billboard announcing the presence of ice. The air grew sharp, biting at the exposed skin of the passengers strolling on the deck, forcing them inside to the warmth of the lounges. This natural curfew was convenient. It cleared the decks, removing potential witnesses from the railings and confining them to the brightly lit, isolated worlds of the smoking room and the palm court. The promenade became a ghost town, leaving the outer skin of the ship unobserved. For a crew preparing to open a lower shell door or signal a nearby vessel, the cold was not a nuisance. It was a cloak of invisibility. By 8:55 p.m., Captain Smith excused himself from the dinner party in the à la carte restaurant. He did not go to the bridge to command the ship through the known danger. He went to his cabin. The official record says he was resting. The criminal hypothesis suggests he was waiting. He had left standing orders. If in the slightest degree doubtful, let me know. It is a phrase of calculated ambiguity. Doubtful of what? The ice or the rendezvous? If the plan was to stop the ship near the ice field to offload the bullion, Smith needed to be fresh for the critical hours after midnight. His retreat to the cabin removed the figure of authority from the bridge, leaving the junior officers to manage the routine while the real operation was prepped in the shadows. At 9:40 p.m., the timeline pivots on a piece of paper. The Masaba warning arrived, explicitly detailing the ice barrier directly ahead. Jack Phillips, the senior wireless operator, received it. He did not deliver it to the bridge. He spiked it under a paperweight. We have analyzed this as fatigue, but in a heist, this is the go signal. By suppressing the warning, Phillips ensured the ship would not slow down prematurely. The Titanic had to reach the specific coordinates where the Samson was lurking. Slowing down would miss the window, turning south would miss the rendezvous entirely. The suppression of the Masaba message was the act that locked the ship onto its collision course. It was not negligence, it was navigation by omission. At 10:00 p.m., the watch changed. First Officer Murdoch relieved Second Officer Lightoller on the bridge. They stood together in the wing, their eyes adjusting to the darkness. They discussed the ice. "It's a bit clear tonight," Lightoller remarked. They knew the ice was there, and yet they did not reduce speed. The ship charged forward at nearly full steam. This behavior is suicidal unless the speed was necessary to reach the breaking point, the exact location where the extraction was to take place. They were racing to the finish line of the crime, unaware that the finish line was a solid wall of ice. At 10:30 p.m., the final piece of the communications blackout fell into place. The Californian, drifting 10 miles away, signaled that she was stopped in ice. Phillips told them to shut up. The Californian's operator turned off his set. Now, the ocean was silent. No one could hear the Titanic scream. This silence was the prerequisite for the transfer. You cannot offload gold with the world listening in. The dead air created a private room in the middle of the Atlantic. Down in the depths, on G-deck and the orlop deck, the shadow crew, the men we suspect were operatives, would have been moving into position. The postal clerks were likely already anxious, sensing the deviation in routine. The specie room was prepped. The chains and pulleys needed to move the heavy crates were likely rigged in the gloom of the cargo handling areas. They were waiting for the engines to stop. They expected the all-stop order to come voluntarily, a command from the bridge to drift for the night. They were ready to open the shell doors. At 11:30 p.m., the Samson was close. The lookouts on the Titanic, Fleet and Lee, were staring into a black void, their eyes tearing from the cold wind. Without binoculars, their depth perception was non-existent. They were looking for an iceberg, but perhaps they were also subconsciously looking for the signal light of the rendezvous ship. The horizon was a blur of haze and stars. The ship was rushing through the water at 37 feet per second. Then, at 11:39 p.m., the illusion shattered. Fleet saw the black mass blocking out the stars. He rang the bell 3 times. "Iceberg, right ahead." On the bridge, Murdoch reacted with the instincts of a sailor, not a conspirator. He shouted, "Harder starboard," and rang the engines to full astern. But here lies the critical friction. The ship was too heavy, too fast, and too close. The plan had been to stop near the ice, not at it. They had cut the margin too fine. The greed for speed to meet the schedule of the theft had robbed them of the space to maneuver. At 11:40 p.m., the starboard side of the Titanic ground against the underwater spur of the iceberg. It was not a crash, it was a long, sickening tear. The sound was a metallic shriek that vibrated through the hull, heard clearly by the men in the forward boiler rooms, but barely registered by the diners in the first-class saloon. The iceberg popped rivets, buckled plates, and opened the sea to the ship. But the most damning moment came seconds after the collision. The ship slowed to a halt. Then, inexplicably, Captain Smith ordered, "Half ahead." The ship started moving again for a few minutes. Why? Why drive a damaged ship forward, forcing water into the hull faster? Unless he was trying to limp to the rendezvous point. Unless he saw the lights of the Samson and tried to close the gap. Or perhaps he was trying to beach the ship on the ice shelf itself to save the cargo. Down below, the collision would have thrown the heist into chaos. The crates of bullion, perhaps already unstacked, would have shifted. The water began to spray into the mailroom immediately. The postal clerks were now fighting a war on 2 fronts, the rising ocean and the collapsing plan. They realized the controlled stop had become a catastrophic breach. The extraction team, waiting at the shell doors, was suddenly standing in a flooding compartment. The order to stop engines finally came. The silence that followed was terrifying. It was the silence of a heart stopping. The steam roared from the funnels, venting the pressure that was no longer needed for propulsion. The lights of the Samson bobbed in the distance, watching. The thieves on the smaller ship realized the plan was dead. They saw the Titanic settling by the head. They did not come closer to help. They turned their rudders and began to drift away, disappearing into the mist of history. The reconstruction reveals a night where 2 scripts were running simultaneously. The script of the voyage, with its dinners and music, and the script of the crime with its silenced radios and suppressed warnings. At 11:40 p.m., the ice tore through both scripts. The perfect crime was wrecked, the gold was trapped, and the men who had planned to walk away rich were now standing on a sloping deck, realizing that the only thing they would be extracting that night was the bitter realization of their own mortality. The heist was over. The tragedy had begun. But even as the water rose, the cover-up continued. The open shell door, the missing logbooks, the silence. They were all attempts to hide the truth, even as the evidence sank into the abyss. In every complex investigation, there is a singular moment where the seamless narrative of the accident fractures, revealing the jagged edge of something deliberate. Criminologists call this the discontinuity, the detail that simply does not fit the physics of a natural disaster. For the Titanic, this moment occurred roughly 10 minutes after the collision, when the ship, already mortally wounded and taking on tons of water per second, did the one thing that no sinking vessel should ever do. She started moving again. The order given by Captain Smith was half ahead. It is a command that has baffled maritime historians for decades. Why, after striking an iceberg and receiving immediate reports of flooding in the forward compartments, would a seasoned captain drive his ship forward? The hydrodynamics are simple and brutal. Driving a damaged ship forward forces water into the hull with hydraulic pressure, exponentially increasing the rate of flooding. It is akin to driving a car with a shattered windshield directly into a hurricane. It turns a manageable leak into a catastrophic deluge. Smith knew this. He was not an amateur. Yet the telegraphs in the engine room rang, and the massive propellers began to turn once more. The ship lurched forward, pushing a wave of water into her own open wounds. The Atlantic extraction theory offers the only logical explanation for this suicidal maneuver. Smith was not trying to save the ship in the traditional sense. He was trying to complete the mission. The collision had occurred roughly a mile or two short of the rendezvous point. The mystery ship, the Samson, was drifting just out of reach, perhaps visible only as a faint light in the distance. The half-ahead order was a desperate attempt to limp the final distance, to bring the shell doors alongside the waiting tender so the transfer could still take place. It was the decision of a man who was more afraid of failing his shadow employers than he was of the ocean. He gambled that the bulkheads would hold long enough to offload the bullion. He lost that gamble. The movement forced the ship deeper by the head, overwhelming the pumps and sealing the vessel's fate. But the movement of the ship is only half of the discontinuity. The other, far more damning piece of evidence is found on the port side of D-deck. During the evacuation, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who was overseeing the loading of lifeboats, peered over the railing and saw something that stopped his heart. The large gangway door on D-deck, a massive steel portal used for loading passengers and cargo in port, was wide open. Lightoller testified to this at the British inquiry. He assumed that the door had been opened on the orders of an officer to facilitate loading lifeboats from a lower level, a plan that was never communicated or executed. But this explanation falls apart under scrutiny. Opening a gangway door at sea is a complex operation requiring a team of men and hand-cranked gears. It is not done on a whim. Furthermore, once opened, the door was never used for passengers. No lifeboat was ever lowered to D-deck. No queue of passengers was ever directed there. The door stood open, a gaping mouth just feet above the rising waterline, serving no life-saving purpose whatsoever. In the context of the heist, however, the open door is the smoking gun. It is the entry wound of the crime. If the plan was to offload the gold to a smaller vessel, the D-deck gangway or the E-deck shell doors would be the primary exit points. The conspirators, likely posing as crew, had cracked the door open in anticipation of the Samson pulling alongside. When the ship started moving again, half ahead, the water pressure against the hull would have made closing the heavy steel door nearly impossible. Then, as the ship settled by the bow, the waterline rose to the lip of the door. What happened next was not an accident, it was a deluge. As the bow dipped, the Atlantic Ocean didn't just seep into the Titanic, it poured in through the open gangway door like a river. Naval architects who have analyzed the sinking rate have long struggled to explain why the Titanic sank so much faster than their mathematical models predicted. The open D-deck door provides the missing variable. It bypassed the watertight bulkheads entirely, allowing water to flood aft into sections of the ship that should have remained dry for hours. This secondary flooding is what caused the sudden, violent list to port that passengers described. It is what robbed the ship of her stability. The Titanic was not just sunk by an iceberg, she was scuttled by an open door. The thieves, in their attempt to create an exit for the gold, had created an entrance for the sea. The image is chilling. A team of operatives in the cargo hold, struggling with the gears of the door, realizing too late that the water is rising too fast, abandoning their post and fleeing into the labyrinth of the ship, leaving the door agape. They left the back door of the fortress unlocked while the enemy was at the gates, This discontinuity also explains the strange behavior of the mystery ship. If the Samson was indeed waiting nearby, her crew would have been watching through binoculars. They would have seen the Titanic slow down, then lurch forward, and then begin to list. They would have seen the distress rockets, the universal sign that the plan had failed. A smuggler does not board a sinking ship. He runs from it. The sight of the Titanic firing rockets was the signal to abort. The Samson turned its lights away and vanished into the dark, leaving the conspirators on the Titanic trapped with the evidence of their crime. We must also consider the silence of the crew members who survived from the lower decks. Why did no one mention the frantic efforts to close the door? Because the men who opened it likely didn't survive. Or if they did, they knew that admitting to opening a hole in the ship's hull would be an admission of mass manslaughter. The open door became a secret carried to the grave, hidden behind the convenient narrative of the iceberg. The moment of discontinuity is the point where the tragedy reveals its human architecture. The half-ahead order and the open D-deck door are not the actions of sailors fighting for survival. They are the actions of men fighting for an objective that had nothing to do with safety. They are the fingerprints of a timeline that prioritized the cargo over the passengers. The collision with the ice was the stroke of bad luck, but the actions that followed, driving the ship forward and opening the hull, were the choices that turned a survival situation into a massacre. The water that flooded D-deck did not just drown the ship. It washed away the logic of the accident, leaving behind the cold, hard geometry of a crime scene. The ship was killed from the inside out, and as the water rushed over the sill of the open gangway door, it sealed the vault, the gold, and the truth in a tomb of pressure and darkness. To hear the voices of the dead, we must open the dusty, bound transcripts of the 1912 inquiries, legal proceedings that were designed less as a search for truth and more as a theater of containment. The United States Senate inquiry, led by the bombastic Senator William Alden Smith, and the British Wreck Commissioners inquiry, presided over by the aristocratic Lord Mersey, were the official mechanisms of history. But if one reads the thousands of pages of testimony not as a legal record, but as a series of fragmented confessions, a very different narrative begins to emerge. These hearings were the first attempt to sanitize the crime scene. The questions asked were technical. How many buckets of water? How many revolutions of the engine? But the answers given often contained slivers of a darker reality. Observations that were quickly interrupted, dismissed, or stricken from the record because they hinted at a conspiracy the world was not ready to accept. The most explosive testimony came from Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall. He was the man on the bridge with the binoculars, borrowed and ill-fitting, the man who fired the rockets, and the man who stood closest to the captain during the final hours. His testimony regarding the mystery ship is a masterpiece of frustrated observation. Boxhall did not just say he saw a light, he swore under oath that he saw a steamer approach the Titanic. He described seeing her two masthead lights and her green starboard sidelight, indicating she was facing them, moving toward them. He testified that the ship got close enough, perhaps within 5 miles, that he could see her portholes with the naked eye, and then he described the behavior that no simple merchant vessel would exhibit. Upon seeing the Titanic's distress rockets, the stranger did not rush to assist. She turned, she showed her red port light and steamed away into the mist. Lord Mersey and the British Board of Trade were desperate to pin this on the Californian, a ship whose captain, Stanley Lord, was an easy scapegoat, but Boxhall was adamant that the ship he saw was moving. The Californian was stopped in ice. The geometry of the sighting did not match. Boxhall was describing a rendezvous that was aborted. He was describing the Samson, or a similar extraction vessel, realizing the drop was compromised by the chaos of the sinking and fleeing the scene. His testimony is the eyewitness account of the getaway driver leaving his accomplices behind. Yet, the inquiry bullied him, questioning his eyesight and his judgment, until his certainty was buried under the convenient narrative of the unresponsive Captain Lord. Then there is the testimony of Ernest Gill, the donkeyman, engine room worker, on the Californian. Gill gave a sworn affidavit that on the night of the disaster, he came on deck to smoke a cigarette and saw a large steamer firing rockets in the distance. But crucially, he also described seeing a smaller steamer, a third ship, moving between them. This testimony was political dynamite. It suggested the ocean was crowded that night. It supported the idea of a multi-vessel operation. But Gill was painted as a disgruntled employee looking for a payout, and his evidence was discarded. The presence of a third ship was an inconvenience to the clean two-ship narrative the inquiries wanted to sell. We must also listen to the silences of the surviving crew. The Black Gang, the firemen and trimmers who worked deep in the ship, were the first to see the damage. Leading fireman Frederick Barrett testified to seeing water rushing into Boiler Room 6 with the force of a fire hose. But there were rumors, persistent and terrified, among the surviving stokers of men in suits being seen in the lower alleyways near the cargo holds after the collision. These rumors never made it into the official transcripts. Why? Because the surviving crew members were immediately sequestered upon arrival in New York and Plymouth. They were threatened with blacklisting. In 1912, if you testified against the White Star Line, you would never work at sea again. The fear of unemployment was a powerful gag order. The crew told the story they were paid to tell, an iceberg, a tragedy, and a disciplined end. They did not mention the open shell doors or the frantic activity in the mailroom because those details were above their pay grade. The testimony regarding the firearms is another jagged edge. The official story admits that officers Murdoch and Lightoller issued guns to maintain order at the lifeboats, but surviving passengers, including third-class survivor Eugene Daly, testified to hearing shots that sounded like war. Daly claimed he saw an officer shoot 2 men dead before turning the gun on himself. This has always been debated as sensationalism. But in the context of a heist, gunfire takes on a different meaning. Were these shots fired to control panic, or were they fired to suppress a mutiny or a realization? If a group of operatives was trying to force their way into a boat with luggage, bullion, an officer like Murdoch, realizing the betrayal, might have used lethal force not to save women and children, but to stop a crime in progress. The suicide of an officer, often attributed to Murdoch or Wilde, might not have been an act of despair, but the final casualty of a shootout on the boat deck. The bodies were lost, and with them the ballistic evidence. Major Arthur Peuchen, a Canadian industrialist and yachtsman who survived, offered testimony that was surprisingly critical of the crew's competence, specifically regarding the handling of the lifeboats and the lack of leadership. But he also mentioned a strange detail: the sheer number of crewmen he didn't recognize standing on the deck smoking cigarettes and doing nothing to help. He assumed they were stokers who had come up from below. But were they? Or were they the passengers from the Samson's contact team, or the hired muscle for the heist, now stranded with nothing to do but wait for death? Their inaction speaks of men who were not trained to save a ship, only to rob it. The inquiries also glossed over the state of the watertight doors. We know the switch was thrown on the bridge. But greaser Frederick Scott testified that immediately after the collision, he saw all the watertight doors in the engine room drop. However, he also mentioned that they could be opened manually from below. We know that some doors were opened later to run pumps and hoses. The Atlantic extraction theory asks, were they open to move crates? Did the thieves override the safety systems to drag their cargo from the flooding forward holds toward the stern? The testimony creates a picture of a ship where the containment system was actively fought against by people moving inside the hull. Perhaps the most haunting testimony comes from the survivors who described the sound of the ship breaking. For decades, the experts at the inquiries insisted the Titanic sank intact. They ignored the hundreds of witnesses who swore she split in two. Why? Because a clean sinking suggests structural integrity. A breakup suggests a weak ship, or perhaps catastrophic internal stresses caused by something other than just water. The denial of the breakup was the first great lie of the technical investigation. It proved that the authorities were willing to ignore the majority of witnesses to protect the reputation of British engineering. If they could lie about the ship snapping in half, what else were they willing to lie about? The witnesses in 1912 were speaking into a vacuum. They were traumatized, intimidated, and steered by lawyers representing the most powerful interests on the Atlantic. But if you strip away the legal maneuvering, their voices form a chorus of anomalies. They saw a ship that turned away. They saw doors that shouldn't be open. They heard gunshots that shouldn't have been fired. They saw men who shouldn't have been there. They were describing a crime scene, but the world was only listening for a tragedy. The testimony is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what was suppressed. And in the gaps between their words, the gold is still missing. To solve a cold case that has been submerged under 2.5 miles of water, we must trade the unreliable memories of human witnesses for the unblinking high-definition gaze of modern technology. For 73 years, the Titanic lay in absolute darkness, shielded by a pressure of 6,000 pounds per square inch, a crushing force that kept her secrets safe from grave robbers and historians alike. But in 1985, when Robert Ballard's camera sled Argo glided over the ocean floor and illuminated a boiler, the immunity of the abyss was shattered. Since then, the wreck has been visited by manned submersibles, remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, and autonomous underwater drones that have mapped every square inch of the debris field with a precision that would shame a crime scene photographer on dry land. And what these machines have found is not just a tragedy frozen in time, but a structural autopsy that supports the theory of the heist. The most significant revelation from the modern era is the confirmation of the open door. For decades, Second Officer Lightola's testimony about the open gangway door on D-deck was treated as a confused memory or an anomaly. But recent expeditions, utilizing nimble ROVs capable of penetrating the rust-choked corridors of the wreck, have provided visual proof. The D-deck door on the port side is indeed wide open. The camera lights reveal the mechanism, the heavy gears and latches, frozen in a position that confirms it was cranked open by human hands and never closed. This is hard, physical evidence. It validates the timeline of the half-ahead maneuver and the accelerated sinking. In the context of the Atlantic extraction theory, this open door is no longer a mystery. It is the escape hatch that became a death sentence. It proves that someone was trying to create an exit point near the waterline, exactly where you would need one to offload heavy cargo to a tender like the Samson. Modern sonar mapping of the debris field has also revolutionized our understanding of the ship's final moments. In 2010, an expedition created a comprehensive 3D map of the entire 3x5-mile site. This map is effectively a ballistic chart of the disaster. It shows exactly where the pieces fell. If the ship had simply hit an iceberg and sank, the debris would be distributed in a specific pattern. But the distribution of heavy machinery and cargo suggests a violent, chaotic breakup that spilled the ship's guts long before she hit the bottom. Forensic analysts looking at the scatter pattern of the cargo from the forward holds have noted curious voids. If the Titanic was carrying a massive shipment of bullion in the specie room and the ship broke apart, one might expect to find a spill of heavy metal in the sediment, a concentration of dense targets that sonar would pick up immediately. The absence of such a spill is telling. Does the absence of gold on the seafloor mean it was never there? Or does it mean it was successfully removed? Or perhaps it remains trapped in the one section of the ship that is most difficult to access? The specie room and the mail room are located deep in the bow section, buried under decks that have pancaked onto one another. However, there is a darker possibility. In 1987, the French Institute IFREMER, in collaboration with Titanic Ventures, launched a controversial expedition to recover artifacts. They used the submersible Nautile, which was equipped with robotic arms capable of delicate manipulation. Rumors have circulated in the maritime community for years that this expedition, or subsequent covert dives funded by private interests, specifically targeted the area of the specie room. The official manifest of recovered items lists innocuous things: leather bags, jewelry, banknotes. But the banknotes were preserved inside leather satchels. If paper can survive, gold certainly can. The conspiracy theory gains traction when we consider the silent dives. We know about the famous expeditions, Cameron, Ballard, the discreet tourist dives. But the North Atlantic is a big place and the coordinates of the wreck are public knowledge. It is technically possible for a private, well-funded operation to visit the wreck. The technology to cut through steel underwater exists. We have seen evidence of modern intrusion on the wreck, areas where rusticles appear to have been knocked away recently, or where plating has been disturbed in ways that natural decay cannot explain. Has the crime scene been tampered with? Is the vault empty because it was emptied in 1912 or because it was emptied in 1987? We must also look at the biological evidence. The wreck is being consumed by a rust-eating bacteria named Halomonas titanici. This microscopic organism is the ocean's way of erasing the evidence. It consumes the iron, turning the sturdy steel plates into fragile rusticles that dissolve into powder when touched. This biological clock is ticking. The area around the mailroom is disintegrating. As the steel walls collapse, they expose the interior to the currents, potentially washing away the last traces of the crates or the shelving that held them. The bacteria are the ultimate cleaners, slowly destroying the fingerprints of the ship's internal configuration. However, modern computer simulations have provided a counter-narrative to the accident. Naval architects have run thousands of scenarios through hydrodynamic software. They input the damage from the iceberg, the flooding rate, and the ship's stability. The simulations consistently show that if the bulkheads had been managed correctly and if the ship had remained stationary, she should have floated for hours longer, perhaps long enough for the Carpathia to arrive. The rapid sinking scenario only works in the simulator when you introduce the variable of the open D-deck door and the movement of the ship. The computer proves that the human decisions made after the collision, the very decisions we attribute to the heist, were the primary cause of the catastrophic loss of life. The math accuses the captain. Furthermore, high-resolution imaging of the hull buried in the mud, using sub-bottom profilers, has revealed that the damage from the iceberg is actually quite small. It is a series of thin slits and popped rivets, spanning less than 12 square feet in total area. This minimal damage makes the speed of the sinking even more suspicious. It reinforces the idea that internal sabotage, opened doors, removed barriers or compromised pumps played a massive role. The iceberg provided the wound, but the ship bled out because someone had tampered with the tourniquet. The lens of the present does not give us a clear photograph of a thief holding a gold bar. Instead, it gives us a high-definition image of a crime scene that matches the profile of the Atlantic extraction theory. We see the open escape route, the door. We see the lack of scattered treasure in the debris field, implying it was moved or secured. We see the mathematical impossibility of the sinking speed without human interference. And we see the frantic, secretive attempts to salvage the wreck in the late 20th century, suggesting that someone still believed there was something down there worth millions. The ROVs drift silently through the grand staircase, their lights illuminating the empty shoes of the dead. But when they descend into the cargo holds, the silence feels different. It feels expectant. The cameras peer into the gloom of the orlop deck, looking for the shape of a crate, the glint of a bar or the broken lock of a security cage. The evidence is there, dissolving into rust. The ocean is slowly reclaiming the Titanic, but before she disappears completely, she is offering us one last look at the structural betrayal that sent her to the bottom. The technology of the future has finally caught up with the crimes of the past, and the verdict is written in the rust. The ship was murdered. To synthesize the disparate shards of evidence into a coherent mosaic, we must construct the strongest hypothesis, a narrative that aligns the mechanical facts of the sinking with the behavioral anomalies of the crew and the mysterious presence of the Samson. When we strip away the romance and the accumulated mythology of a century, the Atlantic extraction theory emerges not as a wild conjecture, but as the only explanation that accounts for every major discontinuity of that night. It connects the silenced wireless warnings, the missing binoculars, the half-ahead order, the open gangway door, and the fleeing mystery ship into a single, logical, and terrifying causal chain. This was not a voyage. It was a delivery run that required a staged interruption. The hypothesis begins in the boardrooms of London and New York, months before the maiden voyage. The objective was the covert transfer of a massive sum of gold bullion, or perhaps highly sensitive bearer bonds, essential for stabilizing a precarious transatlantic financial arrangement. The Titanic, with her widely advertised unsinkable safety features and her secure specie room, was selected as the courier. However, the assets could not simply be unloaded in New York. where customs inspectors and press agents would be waiting. The transfer had to occur in the international waters of the North Atlantic, where the jurisdiction was zero and the darkness was absolute. The plan was audacious but mechanically sound. The Titanic would steam at full speed toward a specific rendezvous point near 40° north, 50° west. The speed was necessary to meet the extraction vessel, the Samson, which had been dispatched from a northern port under the guise of a sealing expedition. To justify stopping a mail steamer in the middle of the ocean, the conspirators utilized the seasonal ice field. The ice was not a danger to be avoided, it was the cover story. This explains why J. Bruce Ismay and Captain Smith possessed ice warnings but did not slow down. They were aiming for the ice. The plan called for the Titanic to enter the vicinity of the pack ice, claim that navigation was too dangerous to proceed, and order a precautionary halt for the night. Once the ship was dead in the water, drifting in the calm sea, the Samson would slip alongside the port hull, shielded from the view of the first-class promenade by the bulk of the ship and the darkness of the moonless night. The Shadow Crew, a team of operatives embedded as stokers and postal clerks, would open the gangway door on D-deck or the shell doors on E-deck. Using the cargo hoists, they would transfer the crates to the waiting tender. The entire operation would take perhaps 90 minutes. By dawn, the Samson would be gone, the Titanic would resume her voyage to New York, and the danger of the ice would be praised as the reason for the delay. But the plan contained a fatal flaw. It relied on the precision of nature. The conspirators needed to stop near the ice, not hit it. They had stripped the crow's nest of binoculars to ensure that any spotting of the ice would happen late enough to justify a hard stop, but they miscalculated the visibility conditions. The calm sea masked the icebergs until the very last second. When Frederick Fleet rang the bell at 11:39 p.m., the Titanic was not arriving at a controlled rendezvous. She was careening into a wall. The collision ripped the script apart. Here is where the hypothesis explains the inexplicable. The collision caused damage, yes, but it was not immediately catastrophic in the minds of the conspirators. They believed the ship was unsinkable. Their primary concern was not the water, it was the schedule. The Samson was nearby. Boxhall saw her lights. The Titanic had stopped, but she was drifting away from the extraction point. This is why Captain Smith, likely under intense pressure from Ismay or the extraction team leader, ordered half ahead. They were trying to close the distance to the Samson to salvage the operation. They needed to get the ship alongside the tender to offload the gold before the situation deteriorated. It was a gamble that the pumps could handle the flooding while the transfer was completed. Simultaneously, the operatives on D-deck cracked open the gangway door. They were prepping for the transfer, expecting the tender to pull up at any moment. They did not realize that by driving the ship forward, they were forcing water into the bow, pulling the ship down by the head. As the bow dipped, the waterline rose to the level of the open door. The half-ahead maneuver transformed the D-deck door into a massive intake valve. The operatives, seeing the water rushing in, fled the scene, leaving the door wide open. This is the moment the heist turned into a massacre. The open door allowed water to bypass the watertight bulkheads, flooding the ship from above the containment lines. On the horizon, the captain of the Samson watched through his glass. He was expecting a quiet ship and a dark transfer. Instead, he saw a liner venting steam, pitching forward, and suddenly firing white distress rockets. In the code of the sea, rockets mean help. In the code of a smuggler, rockets mean the police are coming, or the plan is blown. The Samson did not flee because they were heartless. They fled because they were criminals. They turned their lights away to avoid being identified near a sinking ship, terrified that they would be implicated in the disaster. They left their accomplices to die. The wireless silence of the Californian also fits this grim logic. If Captain Lord was a secondary participant, paid to sit nearby as a backup or a relay, his turning off the wireless was standard operational security to ensure no one overheard the coordination. When he saw the rockets, he too stayed put, paralyzed by the realization that the staged stop had become a real emergency, and any move he made would reveal his complicity. Inside the Titanic, the Shadow Crew was trapped. The mailroom was flooding. The gangway was underwater. The gold was heavy and immovable. The postal clerks who died dragging mailbags were likely the operatives trying to save the cargo until the very last second, or perhaps trying to destroy the evidence of the manifest. The men in suits seen in the lower decks were the heist team, realizing there was no way off the ship. The suicide of an officer on the bridge was the final tragic conclusion to the conspiracy, a realization by a man like Murdoch or Wilde that they had been pawns in a game that had just killed 1,500 people. This hypothesis is the strongest because it requires the fewest coincidences. It does not rely on bad luck. It relies on human greed and the mechanical consequences of specific actions. The suppressed warnings, the maintained speed, the open door, the resumed movement. The Titanic was destroyed by a collision of agendas. The ice breach was survivable. The heist was not. The ship sank because her crew tried to rob her while she was bleeding, and as she went down, she took the gold, the evidence, and the truth into the crushing dark, leaving the world with a tragedy that was perfectly designed to look like an accident. To be a responsible investigator, one must inevitably sit across the table from the devil's advocate and subject the seductive elegance of a conspiracy theory to the brutal erosion of Occam's razor. The Atlantic extraction theory is compelling because it provides a motive for the madness. It imposes a script upon the chaos. But the contra-hypothesis, the traditional narrative supported by the vast majority of maritime historians, naval architects, and archivists, argues that we are looking for a villain where we should be looking for something far more common and far more deadly: incompetence. The skeptic argues that there was no heist, no gold, and no rendezvous. There was only a perfect storm of hubris, antiquated regulations, and a series of unfortunate human errors that cascaded into a catastrophe. The primary argument against the heist begins with the character of Captain Edward Smith. To the conspiracy theorist, his actions, ignoring warnings, maintaining speed, the bizarre half-ahead order, read as the maneuvers of a compromised man. But to the historian, they read as the standard operating procedure of a captain in 1912. Smith was not a maverick. He was a creature of habit. The practice of steaming through ice was not suicidal recklessness in the context of the era. It was the industry standard. Captains believed that if the weather was clear, they could spot ice in time to turn. They relied on their lookouts. Smith's speed was not an attempt to make a rendezvous. It was an attempt to impress his bosses by beating the Olympics' arrival time. He was not racing toward a crime, he was racing toward a retirement party. His failure was not malice, it was a failure of imagination. He simply could not conceive of an object large enough to sink his ship that he wouldn't see in time. Regarding the half-ahead order, the contra-hypothesis offers a psychological rather than criminal explanation. Smith was in shock. When the collision occurred, the reality of the situation likely did not sink in immediately. The order to move forward may have been a reflex, a desire to test the ship's responsiveness, or perhaps a fleeting hope that they could limp toward Halifax or New York. It was the confusion of a man whose worldview was collapsing, not the calculated move of a smuggler trying to close a gap. The result was the same: water forced into the hull, but the intent was desperate survival, not extraction. The open door on D-deck, the smoking gun of our crime theory, also has a tragic, innocent explanation. Second Officer Lightoller testified that there was a plan, conceived in the first 20 minutes of the disaster, to load lifeboats from the lower gangway doors. This would allow the boats to be lowered empty, and thus safer, and then filled with passengers closer to the water. The door was opened by a bosun, and a team of men acting on legitimate orders to facilitate a rescue. They never used the door because the water rose too fast, and in the chaos, the men sent to open it were likely swept away or forced to retreat before they could close it. It was a failed lifeline, not an escape hatch. The fact that it accelerated the sinking is a cruel irony, but it does not require a conspiracy to explain it. It only requires a crew trying to improvise a rescue plan on a sinking ship they didn't fully understand. Then there is the matter of the gold itself. Where is the paper trail? A transfer of bullion worth millions leaves ripples in the financial record. Critics point out that the Bank of England's archives are meticulous. There is no record of missing reserves in 1912. There is no insurance claim for lost bullion filed by any major bank. If the gold was stolen, who did it belong to? A secret cabal. The skeptic argues that this enters the realm of fiction. The manifest listed raw feathers, machinery, and oak beams because that is what was on board. The heavy crates seen by witnesses were likely auto parts or machine components, which are heavy and require care but are not gold. The postal clerks died saving mailbags because they were dedicated civil servants who took their oath seriously, a concept of duty that perhaps seems alien to the modern cynical mind, but was absolute in the Edwardian era. The mystery ship also dissolves under scrutiny. The Samson's logs were indeed inconsistent, but historians argue this was due to illegal sealing, not gold smuggling. A small wooden sealer bobbing next to a massive liner like the Titanic would risk being crushed against the hull in the open ocean swells. A transfer of heavy crates between two ships at sea, at night, without modern cranes or stabilizers, is logistically nearly impossible. It would take hours, not minutes. The lights seen by Boxhall were almost certainly the Californian, distorted by a phenomenon known as cold water mirage or super-refraction, which can make a ship appear closer or further away than it is. The Californian didn't respond because her captain was asleep and her wireless was off. Laziness and adherence to regulation, not conspiracy. As for the missing binoculars, the contra-hypothesis presents Hanlon's razor. Never attribute to malice that which is adequately explained by stupidity. David Blair, the officer bumped from the voyage, simply forgot to hand over the key to the locker. It was a mistake made in the rush of departure. It happens. If it was sabotage, why leave the binoculars on board at all? Locking them away is a clumsy way to disable the lookouts compared to simply losing them over the side. The lack of binoculars likely made no difference anyway. In a pitch-black, moonless night with a calm sea, binoculars reduce the field of vision. The lookouts needed their naked eyes to scan the horizon. They didn't see the iceberg because the conditions, no moon, no breaking waves, rendered it invisible until it blotted out the stars. The wireless silence. Jack Phillips was an exhausted 25-year-old man who had been fixing a broken transmitter for hours the night before. When the Californian blasted his ears with a loud signal, because they were so close, he snapped. "Shut up" was standard operator shorthand for "Get off the line, I am working." It was professional rudeness, not criminal suppression. He was prioritizing the passenger messages because that was his job. He was paid by Marconi to send telegrams, not to run the ship's navigation. The tragedy lies in the commercialization of safety, not the subversion of it. Finally, the contra-hypothesis asks us to consider the sheer scale of the silence required. A conspiracy of this magnitude would require the complicity of the captain, senior officers, the wireless operators, the postal clerks, the lookouts, and the crew of the Samson. It would require Bruce Ismay and the shore staff, dozens of people. And yet in the century since, not a single deathbed confession, not a single hidden diary, not a single slipped word has surfaced to confirm it. The Samson crew spoke of seeing lights, but never of gold. The Titanic crew spoke of ice, but never of a heist. Secrets of this size are like air bubbles underwater. They eventually fight their way to the surface. The fact that the silence has held for 113 years suggests there is nothing to hide. The contra-hypothesis paints a picture that is, in many ways, more terrifying than the crime. It suggests that there was no master plan, no evil genius, and no grand design. There was only a collection of flawed human beings, tired, cold, arrogant, and dutiful, operating a machine they thought was perfect, in an ocean they thought they had tamed. The open door was a mistake. The speed was a habit. The silence was a glitch. The Titanic did not die because she was murdered. She died because she was mortal, and the men commanding her forgot that fact. The gold is a fantasy we invented, because it is easier to accept a villain than to accept that 1,500 people can die simply because a key was forgotten and a warning was ignored. But as the skeptical historian closes his file, he must admit one thing. The open door on D-deck is still open, and until someone can prove exactly why it was opened, The ghost of the heist will never truly leave the wreck. To pinpoint the exact second where the tragedy became irreversible, we must look past the iceberg. The collision was a wound, yes, but it was a survivable one. The Titanic was designed to float with 4 compartments flooded. At midnight she was flooding in 5, but the rate was manageable. The pumps were working, the lights were burning. The ship was holding her breath. The true climax of the night, the moment the narrative shifted from a salvageable accident to a total loss of life, occurred not at 11:40 p.m., but at roughly 1:15 a.m. in the chaotic, steam-choked darkness of the starboard boat deck. This was the moment the conspiracy collapsed, and the men who had gambled with the lives of 3,000 people realized the house had won. The scene on the deck was a surreal juxtaposition of Edwardian etiquette and primal terror. The band was playing ragtime, a cheerful soundtrack to an execution. The distress rockets were exploding overhead, bathing the deck in a ghostly white flash every few minutes. But beneath this public drama, the shadow crew, the operatives tasked with the bullion extraction, were facing a private apocalypse. They had abandoned the D-deck door. The water was pouring in through the open gangway like a fire hose, dragging the bow down with terrifying speed. The Samson, their lifeline, had turned its stern and vanished. They were stranded, and they were armed. This brings us to the most controversial and suppressed confrontation of the night, the incident at the starboard collapsible boats. History tells us that First Officer William Murdoch worked tirelessly to load the boats, allowing men on board if no women were waiting. But witness testimony from the inquests hints at a violent struggle near the bridge that was quickly hushed up. In our investigation, this is the final showdown. The conspirators, realizing the gold was lost and the extraction vessel was gone, shifted their objective from profit to survival. They were not passengers. They were professionals who knew the odds. They needed a boat, and they were not willing to wait for women and children first. Picture the scene through the lens of the heist. A group of men, dressed perhaps in stoker's gear or ill-fitting suits, surging toward collapsible sea. These were the men Pushin saw, the ones standing idly by, smoking, waiting for the signal that never came. Now, the signal was the slant of the deck. They moved with the coordination of a unit. Murdoch, standing by the davits with his Webley revolver, saw them coming. He wasn't just seeing panicked passengers, he was seeing the men who had been lurking in the lower decks, the men whose presence had felt wrong all voyage. Perhaps he recognized a face from the restricted area near the Specia room. Perhaps, in that flash of adrenaline, he connected the open shell door, the speed, and the strange orders from the captain. He realized the ship was not dying of natural causes. She was being murdered. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Witnesses reported shots fired. The official story is that officers fired into the air to stop a rush of steerage passengers. But the trajectory of the bullets and the bodies tells a different story. Eugene Daly saw an officer shoot 2 men dead before shooting himself. If Murdoch fired, who was he shooting? A terrified immigrant trying to save his family, or a hired thug trying to hijack a lifeboat at gunpoint? The Atlantic extraction theory posits that Murdoch held the line against the conspirators. He used lethal force to prevent the operatives from taking the seats meant for the innocent. The rush was not a mob of panic. It was a tactical assault on the last means of escape. As the gunshots cracked over the sound of the escaping steam, the ship gave a lurch. This was the physical manifestation of the open D-deck door, finally swallowing enough water to destabilize the vessel's center of gravity. The list to port worsened. The water began to wash over the forward well deck. The time for negotiation was over. The operatives who survived the confrontation scattered, melting back into the crowd, shedding their identity as conspirators and adopting the camouflage of victims. They cast off their allegiance to the gold and clung to the railings, just like everyone else. The heist was officially abandoned, but the most damning decision, the true climax of the crime, was happening simultaneously on the bridge. Captain Smith, arguably the most tragic figure in this web, was seen walking into the wheelhouse. He did not go to a lifeboat. He did not try to save himself. Why? The traditional narrative says he went down with his ship out of honor. The criminal narrative suggests he went down with his ship out of guilt. He knew about the speed. He knew about the half-ahead order that had pumped the sea into the hull. He knew about the rendezvous. Standing in the quiet of the wheelhouse, watching the black water rise up the glass windows, Smith realized that he had been the architect of his own destruction. He had traded his reputation for a promise of security that was as hollow as the double bottom of the ship. His decision to stay was not heroism. It was a self-imposed sentence. He was the only man who could testify to the plot, and by choosing to die, he was closing the case file forever. Down in the hull, the specie room was now submerged. The pressure was building. The crates of bullion or bonds, the motive for the entire disaster, were tumbling in the dark as the ship groaned and twisted. The postal clerks were dead, their bodies drifting in the flooded corridors of the orlop deck. The evidence was being erased by the Atlantic. The open door on D-deck was now 50 feet underwater, an invisible wound that continued to suck the life out of the ship. The climax of the drama was the realization that the unsinkable cover story had worked too well. It had worked so well that it fooled the conspirators themselves. They believed they had time. They believed the ship was a fortress, but by opening the gates to let the gold out, they had let the enemy in. The ship's final plunge began not with a groan of steel, but with the silence of the Samson turning away. That betrayal was the knife in the back. The conspirators were left to die on the stage they had set. As 2:00 a.m. approached, the stern began to rise. The lights flickered, once, twice, and then stayed on, a testament to the engineers dying in the darkness below to keep the power running. These engineers were the innocent counterweight to the conspirators. While one group had opened the doors to sink the ship, the other group stayed at their posts to keep the lights on, giving the passengers a few more minutes of hope. The contrast is blinding. The crime required darkness. The heroism required light. The final image of this climax is not the ship disappearing, but the faces of the men in Lifeboat C, the boat that carried J. Bruce Ismay away from the wreck. Ismay sat facing aft, unable to look at the ship. Was he hiding his eyes from the horror of the drowning, or was he hiding his face from the men in the water who might recognize him? He had survived the heist. He had survived the sinking. But as the boat rode away into the night, leaving the screams behind, the weight of the gold he didn't save was replaced by the weight of the silence he would have to keep for the rest of his life. The ship was gone. The crime was buried. But the consequences were just beginning to float to the surface. When the great ship finally slipped beneath the surface at 2:20 a.m., the noise of the destruction, the groaning steel, the exploding boilers, the crashing furniture, was replaced by a silence that was far more terrifying. It was the silence of the void. But in the days, years, and decades that followed, that silence was filled with the weeping of those who were left behind. In a standard maritime disaster, we mourn the loss of life as a tragic intersection of bad luck and nature. But when we view the Titanic through the lens of the Atlantic extraction theory, the grief takes on a heavier, more bitter quality. The 1,500 men, women, and children who froze to death in the black water were not just victims of an iceberg. They were the collateral damage of a heist. They were the acceptable losses in a spreadsheet, calculated by men who were safe in warm boardrooms thousands of miles away. The human cost of the conspiracy is best understood not by looking at the statistics, but by looking at the specific families whose lineages were severed that night. Consider the Sage family from Peterborough. John and Annie Sage were traveling to Florida with their 9 children, ranging in age from 4 to 20. They were not wealthy. They were the backbone of the working class, moving to America for a chance at the life that the Edwardian class system denied them in England. On the night of the sinking, the Sages never made it to a lifeboat. History tells us they were trapped by the complexity of the ship and the lack of guidance. But the heist theory adds a darker dimension to their fate. The third-class areas on G-deck and F-deck were adjacent to the cargo holds, where the shadow crew would have been operating. If the corridors were locked down, not just to segregate classes as is commonly believed, but to secure the operational perimeter of the bullion transfer, then the Sages were not just lost, they were barricaded in. Witnesses reported that certain gates, usually open for stewardship access, were inexplicably chained. Was this the work of a nervous extraction team trying to keep witnesses away from the shell doors? The Sages, dragging their luggage and carrying their terrified toddlers, may have run into a wall of security that was actually a wall of containment. Their death was total. 11 members of one family wiped off the face of the earth in a single hour. The crime didn't just kill them, it erased their future. Then there is the tragedy of the Allison family in first class. Hudson and Bess Allison were traveling with their 2 children, Lorraine and Trevor. They were the epitome of the target demographic for the White Star Line: young, wealthy, and beautiful. Yet Bess and Lorraine became the only first-class woman and child to perish. The official story is that they were searching for their missing baby, Trevor, who had been taken to a lifeboat by his nursemaid without their knowledge. But why was the confusion so absolute? Reports suggest that Hudson Allison was frantic, not just because of the sinking, but because he was being given contradictory information by officers who seemed distracted. If the bridge was paralyzed by the failure of the heist and the half-ahead disaster, the flow of information to the passengers broke down completely. Hudson Allison, a man of influence, may have demanded answers from an officer who was currently realizing he was an accomplice to manslaughter. The chaos that separated the Allisons was not just the fog of war, it was the fog of a cover-up. Lorraine Allison, clutching her mother's hand on the tilting deck, was a victim of a command structure that had stopped caring about passengers and had started caring about liability. Her small body, lost to the Atlantic, is the ultimate indictment of a plan that prioritized gold over innocence. We must also consider the silent widows, the women who survived but whose husbands were silenced. Madeline Astor, pregnant and 18, sat in a lifeboat watching the lights of the ship disappear. Her husband, John Jacob Astor IV, was a man who could have bought the Titanic 10 times over. He had asked to join her in the boat and was denied. But Astor was also a man who knew the secrets of the financial world. If he had seen something, a crate being moved, a conversation between Ismay and a stranger, a look of guilt on the captain's face, he was a liability. Did he stand on the deck with such stoic resignation because he accepted his fate, or because he realized he had been trapped in a game he couldn't buy his way out of? His death removed a potential titan of industry who could have funded a private investigation into the truth. The crew's families in Southampton paid a price that was both emotional and economic. In the Northam district, entire streets were draped in black crepe. Almost every house lost a father, a brother, or a son. But for the families of the shadow crew, the operatives inserted into the manifest under false names, the grief was compounded by ambiguity. These men simply vanished. They were not listed on the memorial walls. Their wives received no pension from the White Star Line because the company had no record of their employment. They were ghosts who died doing a job that didn't exist. Their families were left to starve, haunted by the lack of a body and the lack of a name to mourn. The heist didn't just kill these operatives, it disavowed them. The survivors who made it to the Carpathia carried the burden of the crime in their minds. Many of them suffered from what we now call survivor's guilt, but for some it was mixed with a gnawing suspicion. They replayed the events in their heads: the lack of alarm, the open doors, the strange men, the rockets fired at a ship that turned away. For a century, these survivors were told they were crazy or confused or traumatized. The official narrative gaslighted them. You didn't see a ship turn away, you saw a mirage. You didn't see a gunfight, you saw panic. The psychological toll of having your own memory denied by the weight of history is a secondary trauma. They were forced to live with the official truth, while the real truth rotted in their nightmares. The economic devastation rippled outward. The loss of breadwinners threw hundreds of families into immediate destitution. The Titanic Relief Fund was established, but it was a charity, not a settlement. It distributed pennies to people who had lost their entire world. The injustice is staggering. If the Atlantic extraction theory is true, then the White Star Line and the banking consortiums involved were not just liable for negligence, they were liable for criminal conspiracy. The families should have owned the line. Instead, they were given blankets and soup and told to be grateful for their rescue. The disparity between the value of the cargo, millions in gold, and the value placed on the lives of the steerage passengers is the mathematical proof of the era's cruelty. The gold was insured, the immigrants were not. And what of the Titanic orphans, Michelle and Edmund Navratil? Their father, risking everything to bring them to a new life, died placing them in the last lifeboat. They became the poster children of the disaster, holding their toy boats in the newspapers, but they also represent the stolen legacy. Their father's dream was cut short not by an accident, but by a schedule. He died because the ship didn't slow down. He died because the binoculars were locked away. He died because the door was open. Every orphan created that night was a victim of a specific, calculated decision made by a stranger. The consequences of the crime extended to the reputation of the innocent. Captain Smith, despite his fatal errors, is remembered as a hero. But if he was a conspirator, even a reluctant one, his statue in Lichfield is a monument to a lie. Conversely, men like J. Bruce Ismay were vilified for surviving. The public needed a villain, and Ismay was convenient. But if Ismay was merely the mark, the fool who was played by deeper interests, then his lifetime of public shaming was a deflection. The real villains were never on the posters. The anger of the world was directed at the visible targets, leaving the architects of the heist to retreat into the shadows, untouched by the grief that drowned a generation of families. The human toll of the Titanic is not a closed book. It is a scar that runs through the history of the 20th century. The families of the dead did not just lose loved ones, they lost the truth. They were sold a story of heroism and ice to cover up a story of greed and incompetence. The children who grew up without fathers were told, God took him. They were never told that perhaps the bank took him. As we look back at the faces in the black and white photographs, the Sages, the Allisons, the unnamed Stokers, we must recognize that they were not just passengers on a ship. They were hostages on a delivery vehicle. And when the delivery failed, they were the cargo that was jettisoned to keep the secret afloat. To sanitize a crime scene of this magnitude, one does not use bleach, one uses bureaucracy. The official investigations into the sinking of the Titanic, the United States Senate inquiry, and the British Board of Trade inquiry are historically viewed as earnest attempts to understand a tragedy. But through the lens of the Atlantic extraction theory, they appear as something far more cynical. The final phase of the heist. This was the getaway executed in a courtroom. The objective was not to find the truth, but to construct a narrative that would protect the insurance payouts, preserve the reputation of the British merchant marine, and bury the rumors of the bullion transfer under a mountain of technical jargon. The verdict was decided before the first gavel fell. It was an accident, and no one was to blame. The American inquiry began with a ferocity that terrified the establishment. Senator William Alden Smith, a man who knew little about ships but a great deal about corruption, launched his investigation while the survivors were still in shock. He boarded the Carpathia the moment she docked in New York, effectively seizing the crew before the White Star Line's handlers could coach them. Smith was ridiculed by the British press as an amateur, mocked for asking if the ship had watertight compartments, but his instincts were sharp. He sensed a cover-up. He grilled the lookouts about the binoculars. He hammered the officers about the mystery ship. He demanded to know why the Titanic was speeding. For a brief moment, it seemed the truth might escape the vault. However, the containment team was already at work. The surviving crew members, the stokers, the stewards, the men who had seen the open doors and the strange cargo, were quickly sequestered. When they returned to England, they were not treated as heroes. They were treated as liabilities. They were held in a shed in Plymouth, denied access to the press and forced to sign documents that effectively gagged them. They were told, explicitly or implicitly, that their future employment depended on their memory failing. The black gang knew who paid their wages. If they spoke of men in suits in the hold or gunshots on the deck, they would starve. Silence was the currency of their survival. The British inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, was a masterclass in judicial choreography. Mersey was not an investigator, he was a cleaner. His mandate was to exonerate the Board of Trade, which had approved the ship's lifeboat capacity, and the White Star Line. The inquiry was populated by naval architects and maritime lawyers who spoke a language of exclusion. They turned the proceedings into a debate about metacentric height and turning circles, boring the public and the press into submission. Whenever a witness veered toward the dangerous territory of the heist, the open door, the third ship, the shots fired, Mersey would intervene, guiding the testimony back to safe waters or dismissing the witness as unreliable. The treatment of the mystery ship is the clearest evidence of the judicial fix. Fourth Officer Boxhall's testimony that he saw a ship moving and turning away was existential poison to the official narrative. If a ship was there and fled, it implied complicity. To neutralize this, the inquiry manufactured a scapegoat, Captain Stanley Lord of the Californian. By pinning the blame on Lord, accusing him of watching the Titanic die and doing nothing, they solved two problems. They explained the lights Boxhall saw, it was the Californian then, and they diverted the public's rage onto a man who wasn't even part of the White Star Line. Captain Lord spent the rest of his life fighting to clear his name, unaware that he was the fall guy for a getaway driver he never met. The Californian became the lightning rod that absorbed the scrutiny, allowing the Samson to sail out of history. Then there was the calculated destruction of J. Bruce Ismay. The managing director was savaged in the press, labeled a coward, and dubbed J. Brute Ismay. This public lynch mob served a very specific purpose. It personalized the disaster. By focusing the world's hatred on one man's moral failure, taking a seat in a boat, the inquiries distracted from the corporate and systemic failures. Ismay became the villain of the pantomime, the man everyone loved to hate. As long as the public was screaming at Ismay, they weren't asking about the cargo. They weren't asking why the ship was speeding. Ismay was the human shield for the syndicate. He accepted his role as the pariah, perhaps because the alternative, exposing the heist, would have meant prison or worse. The most glaring omission in the inquiries was the complete lack of curiosity regarding the cargo. The manifest was accepted without question. There were no subpoenas for the banking records of the consignees. There was no investigation into the insurance policies taken out days before the voyage. The specie room was treated as if it were a linen closet. In a normal investigation of a transport disaster, the cargo is a primary focus. Here it was invisible. This silence suggests that the fix was in at the highest levels of government. The British economy could not afford a scandal involving the theft of sovereign gold. It was better to let the gold go and claim the insurance on a total loss than to admit the security of the Empire's flagship had been breached by criminals. The open-door testimony by Lightoller was the most dangerous moment for the cover-up. Lightoller admitted under oath that the door was open. This should have been the headline, "Crew Error Sank Ship," but Mersey buried it. The final report acknowledged the door might have been open, but concluded it didn't matter. It was a breathtaking act of intellectual dishonesty. They ignored the physics of flooding to protect the reputation of the officers. To admit the door was open was to admit that the crew had actively contributed to the sinking, which would have invalidated the insurance and opened the line to unlimited liability lawsuits from the victims' families. The accident narrative had to be maintained at all costs. The outcome of the inquiries was a whitewash, a term used even by contemporaries. The official verdict was that the Titanic sank due to collision with an iceberg, brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was being navigated. But crucially, Mersey added that this speed was the custom of the trade, and therefore no negligence occurred. It was a legal magic trick. The ship was speeding, but speeding was normal, so no one was to blame. The victims were dead. The gold was gone. The evidence was at the bottom of the sea, and the law had just washed its hands of the whole affair. The investigation was not a failure of justice. It was a triumph of containment. It successfully walled off the crime scene. It silenced the witnesses. It created a historical record that was a fabrication of omissions. Senator Smith tried to find the truth, but was outmaneuvered by the British establishment. Lord Mersey delivered the verdict he was hired to deliver, and the survivors, watching from the gallery, realized that the men in wigs and gowns were not there to help them. They were there to bury the Titanic for a second time. The water took the lives. The inquiry took the truth. And as the books were closed in 1912, the conspirators breathed their first sigh of relief. The perfect crime had been ratified by the state. To reinterpret the Titanic not as a tragedy of hubris, but as a masterpiece of criminal enterprise, is to fundamentally alter the DNA of the 20th century's most enduring myth. For more than 100 years, the world has visited the Titanic as a shrine to human fallibility. We have told ourselves a comforting bedtime story about the arrogance of the Edwardian age. They built a ship they said was unsinkable. God, or nature, struck it down with an iceberg, and the lesson is one of humility. It is a neat moralistic fable. But the Atlantic extraction theory shatters this stained glass window. It strips away the romance of the band played on and replaces it with the cold calculation of a heist. If we accept the possibility of the crime, the Titanic ceases to be a temple of sorrow and becomes the largest, deepest, and most complex crime scene on the planet. This shift in perspective changes everything about how we interact with the cultural legacy of the disaster. The thousands of books, the blockbuster films, the traveling exhibitions of recovered artifacts, they all take on a sinister new light. When we look at a pair of shoes recovered from the debris field, we are no longer just looking at the footwear of a victim of an accident. We are looking at the evidence of a casualty of a conspiracy. The romance of the tragedy, fueled by Hollywood love stories, becomes a grotesque distraction. The violin played by Wallace Hartley is not just a symbol of courage, it is the instrument used to distract the passengers while the vault was being breached. The story is no longer about the hubris of building big ships. It is about the hubris of thinking you can rob the world and get away with it. The cultural obsession with the Titanic has always been driven by a sense of unfinished business. Why do we keep going back? Why are we so desperate to see the wreck, to map it, to recover its porcelain and its whistles? Perhaps it is because, on a subconscious level, the official story has never felt complete. The narrative of the accident has holes that the human intuition tries to fill. We sense the discontinuities, the speed, the silence, the mystery ship, even if we don't articulate them as a heist. The Atlantic extraction theory provides the missing piece that satisfies this nagging doubt. It explains why the tragedy feels so unsettled. It feels unsettled because justice was never done. The file was closed, but the case was never solved. In the modern era, our relationship with the wreck has evolved from reverence to forensic curiosity. The site is no longer just a grave, it is a resource. The controversial salvage expeditions that have brought up thousands of items are often criticized as grave robbing. But in the context of the heist, they are also inadvertent evidence gathering. Every safe brought to the surface, every leather satchel preserved in the mud carries the potential to prove or disprove the theory. The big piece, the massive section of the hull raised in 1998, is not just steel. It is a cross-section of the crime scene, riddled with the popped rivets and fractured plates that tell the story of the ship's structural betrayal. The commercialization of the Titanic, often decried as tasteless, is actually the only force keeping the investigation alive. If there were no profit in the Titanic, she would have been forgotten, and the secret of the gold would have dissolved with the iron. The theory also reframes the technological narrative. We often cite the Titanic as the moment the world lost its faith in technology. But if the heist is real, the technology didn't fail. It was sabotaged. The ship worked perfectly until she was tampered with. The wireless worked until it was silenced. The bulkheads worked until the doors were opened. This transforms the lesson from "technology is dangerous" to "technology is vulnerable to human malice." It is a lesson that resonates profoundly in the 21st century, an age of cyber heists and digital backdoors. The Titanic was the original system hack. The conspirators hacked the schedule, the communication network, and the safety protocols to execute a transfer of assets. They exploited the trust people placed in the machine. What remains open is the ultimate question: where is the proof? The skeptics rightly point out that we have no physical gold, but the new meaning of the case suggests that the proof is not in what is there but in what is missing. The absence of the logbooks, the absence of the binoculars, the absence of the navigational charts, the absence of the Samson's true records. The investigation has moved beyond the search for bullion to the search for the negative space where the truth used to be. The meaning of the Titanic is now found in the silence of the archives. It is found in the redacted memories of the survivors who were told to forget the third ship. The victims too acquire a new dignity. They are no longer passive participants in a natural disaster. They are victims of a specific injustice. The postal clerks become martyrs of duty, who stood against a criminal plot. The steerage passengers locked behind gates become hostages. Captain Smith becomes a tragic Shakespearean figure, torn between honor and complicity. This narrative restores a sense of agency to the dead. They were not just unlucky, they were wronged, and wrongs demand to be remembered even if they cannot be righted. As we look at the wreck today, slowly collapsing under the weight of the ocean and the appetite of the rust-eating bacteria, we realize that time is the final enemy of the truth. The rusticles are consuming the steel evidence. The decks are pancaking, sealing the specie room forever. Soon the ship will be nothing more than a stain on the sediment, but the story has mutated. It has escaped the ship. The Atlantic extraction theory has given the Titanic a second life as a mystery that defies the erosion of the sea. It has ensured that as long as there are people who question authority, who doubt the official line, and who understand the corrupting power of greed, the Titanic will never truly sink. The case of the Titanic is not closed. It is merely waiting for the right technology, or the right document, to surface. Until then, the ship remains the ultimate Rorschach test. Do you see a tragedy, or do you see a crime? The new meaning of the case is that the choice is yours. The ice may have melted, but the cold calculation of that night remains frozen in our collective consciousness. We are no longer mourning a ship. We are investigating a ghost. And the ghost is telling us that the water is deep, but the pockets of the men who planned this were deeper. And so we return to the silence. We have spent the last hours dissecting a tragedy, peeling back the layers of rusted steel and Edwardian hubris to find the cold, hard mechanics of a crime hidden beneath. We have walked the decks with the conspirators, stood on the bridge with a compromised captain, and watched through the fog as a getaway ship turned its stern on 1,500 dying souls. But now the rockets have burned out. The screams have faded into the wind. The band has played its final haunting chord, and the Atlantic has smoothed over the scar, returning to the glass-like perfection that masked the violence of that night. All that remains is the wreck, lying in the eternal midnight of the Titanic Canyon, 2.5 miles down, where the pressure is strong enough to crush a submarine, but apparently not strong enough to crush the truth. The ship is dying a second death. This is the final tragedy of the Titanic. For 73 years she was preserved by the darkness, a museum piece held in suspended animation. But since her discovery, the clock has started ticking again. She is being consumed by the very ocean she tried to conquer. The Halomonas titanicae bacteria are feasting on the iron of her hull, turning the mighty plates of the Olympic-class Leviathan into fragile curtains of rust that look like weeping willows made of dried blood. The superstructure is collapsing. The gymnasium, where T.W. Macaulay once rode his electric camel, is falling into the debris field. The captain's bathtub, once a poignant symbol of the wreck's intimacy, is now buried under sediment. The ship is dissolving. This biological erosion is the final accomplice in the Atlantic extraction theory. Every day, the bacteria eat a little more of the evidence. They are consuming the walls of the specie room. They are dissolving the jagged edges of the shell doors that might still show the marks of pry bars or hand cranks. They are erasing the fingerprints of the crime just as surely as the inquiries of 1912 erased the testimony of the witnesses. Soon, perhaps in 20 or 30 years, the Titanic will be nothing more than a stain on the ocean floor, a rust-colored shadow in the mud, indistinguishable from the geological features of the abyss. When that happens, the vault will be gone, the open door will be gone, and the mystery will be sealed forever, not by a conspiracy of men, but by the indifferent chemistry of the deep. But there are some things the ocean cannot eat. It cannot eat the shoes. Scattered across the debris field, amidst the twisted piping and the shattered china, are pairs of leather boots and shoes lying side by side. The bodies that wore them have long since dissolved, consumed by the sea life, but the tannin in the leather has protected the shoes. They lie there in the mud, marking the exact spot where a person landed after drifting down through 2 miles of water. They are the tombstones of the Heist. Each pair represents a victim of the half-a-head order. Each pair represents a witness who was silenced. They are the silent jury that still sits in judgment of the White Star Line, waiting for a verdict that never came. As we back away from the wreck in our imagination, Ascending through the water column, the darkness gives way to the faint blue of the twilight zone, and finally, to the sunlight of the surface. The ocean looks the same today as it did on April 15, 1912. It is vast, beautiful, and empty. It keeps its secrets well. The Samson is long gone, scrapped in some forgotten yard, her logbooks likely burned or lost to rot. The gold, if it was successfully offloaded, has been melted down, recast, and circulated into the veins of the global economy. You might be wearing a ring or holding a coin that contains a molecule of the Titanic's shadow cargo. The crime was successfully laundered by history, yet the story refuses to sleep. Why does the Titanic haunt us? It is not just the glamour or the tragedy. It is the subconscious recognition that something is wrong with the picture. We sense the missing pieces. We feel the weight of the injustice. We know that the narrative of accidental heroism is too clean, too perfect. The Atlantic extraction theory gives a name to that unease. It tells us that the world is not random, it is calculated. It tells us that even the greatest disasters can be staged, managed, and exploited by men who view human life as a line item on a balance sheet. It is a cynical lesson, but a necessary one. The unsinkable ship sank. But the mystery is truly unsinkable. It rises again and again, buoyed by new technology, new dives, and new questions. The ghosts of the postal clerks, the stokers, and the bewildered passengers are not resting. They are waiting for us to look past the iceberg. They are waiting for us to see the open door. They are waiting for us to acknowledge that they were not sacrificed to nature, but to greed. The story of the Titanic crime is a noir thriller written in steel and ice. It is a story of a heist that went wrong, a cover-up that went right, and a century of silence that is finally beginning to crack. The gold may be gone, but the guilt remains, hanging over the site like the eternal mist of the Grand Banks. The ice melted long ago, returning to the sea. The survivors have all passed on, their memories fading into the ether. But the logic of the crime remains, stark and undeniable to those willing to look. As we close the file on this investigation, we leave the Titanic where she belongs, in the dark. But we leave her with a new understanding. She is no longer just a grave. She is a vault. And although the physical door may be rusting away, the door to the truth has been pried open just a crack. It is up to us to keep looking through it. The ocean is a vast library of forgotten stories, of ships that vanished, of planes that fell, of cities swallowed by the rising tides. The Titanic is but one volume in this archive of the deep. There are other wrecks, other silences, other accidents that bear the fingerprints of design. The water is deep and the history we know is only the surface. Beneath the waves, the currents are still moving, shifting the sands, uncovering new mysteries that demand to be solved. The night is quiet now. The stars are out. The sea is calm. It is the perfect weather for a mystery. We have explored the crime of the century, but the dossier of the ocean is far from closed. There are other signals fading in the static, other distress rockets flaring in the distance, waiting for a witness. The investigation continues, even if the case of the Titanic is resting in the mud. If this investigation resonated with you, feel free to subscribe for more deep and calming explorations of Titanic's forgotten stories.